On a Saturday afternoon in February of 2011, an 18-year-old college student named Michael Perry found himself 1,000 feet underground inside one of America's most dangerous cave systems. He was crouched low inside a vast, dark cavern in Lafayette, Georgia, surrounded by 4 of his friends. As Michael shifted his weight, the beam from his headlamp danced across the cave walls, catching slick rock formations dripping with moisture. The light briefly illuminated underground waterfalls cascading through the darkness before vanishing into deep black crevices that seemed to have no bottom. The entire place felt alien, cold, and completely cut off from the sunny world above. And before that day was over, 2 people inside that cave would be dead. The cave they were exploring was called Ellison Cave. Michael and his friends had driven more than 400 miles from their college town in Gainesville, Florida, just to see it. Ellison was famous among experienced cavers. It was a sprawling underground maze filled with narrow tunnels, massive vertical drops, freezing waterfalls, and pitch-black chambers that could turn deadly in an instant if something went wrong. Every year, adventurers from all over the country traveled there looking for excitement. But, to be perfectly clear, this kind of activity, caving, it was not really Michael's thing. Not at all. He was a marketing major at the University of Florida. If you asked him to describe himself, he would have said he was a pretty quiet person. He enjoyed studying, he liked playing in his school's band, and he dedicated a lot of his time to volunteering with his church youth group. So the idea of crawling through a tiny, pitch-black, intensely claustrophobic hole hundreds of feet beneath the Earth's surface, that did not rank high on his list of fun things to do. In fact, it probably wasn't on the list at all. But Michael wasn't in Ellison Cave that day for fun. He was there for a very specific reason, and that reason was his close friend, a guy named Grant Lockenbach. Grant had been the one to suggest the trip. He was passionate about it, and when Grant got an idea in his head, he was very persuasive. So Michael, being a good friend, had simply said, "Okay, I'll go with you." Just then, Michael glanced over to where Grant was sitting. He was with his girlfriend, a young woman named Carrie, and their 2 other friends were there as well. The group of them were huddled together, looking through a large backpack. They were taking inventory, checking over the various pieces of specialized gear they had brought along with them for the expedition. They had only entered Ellison Cave a few minutes ago, but they had already stopped. The group had paused their progress because there was something in this specific area of the cave that Grant was absolutely determined to see. And when Grant wanted to do something, it almost always happened. That was just the kind of person he was. It's why Michael, despite his reservations, had capitulated and ended up deep inside this mountain. Grant wanted him to come, and so, like he normally did, Michael went along with it. Grant was a natural leader. He was the president of their school's Fellowship of Christian Athletes, a group that Michael, Carrie, and the other 2 friends were also devoted members of. When Michael had first joined the fellowship, Grant had immediately taken him under his wing. He saw something in Michael. He told him that he had tons of potential. In fact, Grant had said that Michael had enough potential to one day become the next president of the fellowship himself. Hearing this from Grant had been a huge deal for Michael. It gave him a massive boost of confidence because he really truly looked up to Grant. And he wasn't alone in that. A lot of people did. Grant was just one of those effortlessly cool guys. He was a few years older than Michael, stood about 6 feet tall, and was basically a walking, talking ball of positive energy. He was always on the lookout for the next adventure, the next challenge to conquer. Caving was one of those adventures. Grant had been exploring caves as a serious hobby for the past 3 years, and out of everyone in their group that day, he was the only one with any real practical caving experience. And it was precisely because of this lack of experience among the others, Michael included, that Grant had chosen an easier route for them. They were navigating a tunnel within Ellison that was basically a straight shot through the mountain. It was a beginner's trail. It didn't require much in the way of technical gear, like ropes or complex climbing equipment. But despite the low level of difficulty for their chosen path, they had brought all of that extra equipment anyway. They had ropes and harnesses and carabiners. They had it all. And that was because along this easier route, right at the spot where they were now stopped, was the entrance to a massive vertical shaft. And Grant specifically wanted to climb down into it, even if he had to go alone. This particular shaft was 125 feet deep. To put that in perspective, imagine a 10-story building. That's how far this pit dropped straight down into the earth. But in the world of serious caving, this was actually considered a small one. It was officially called the warm-up pit because compared to the other, much deeper pits inside Ellison Cave, it was nothing. Some of the other vertical drops in the cave were way, way deeper, some over 500 feet. So while this was definitely not a beginner's task, for an experienced caver like Grant, it was a manageable, almost routine challenge. Michael watched as Grant picked up the backpack, the one with all the equipment inside, and carried it over to the entrance of the pit. The entrance was just a very large, dark hole in the cave floor. It was situated over near a noisy waterfall, and it was only a few feet away from where Michael was standing. So Michael walked over to Grant to offer his help. He wanted to assist him in setting up the gear for his descent. The process involved attaching a long climbing rope securely to the rocks around the pit's edge, creating an anchor that Grant could then use to lower himself safely into the darkness below. This whole setup process is called rigging. It took them a while to get it all done. Michael, again, had no experience with any of this, so he had to wait for Grant to instruct him on every single step. He would hold a rope here, check a knot there, all under Grant's careful direction. But as Michael worked alongside his friend, he found himself peering down into that pitch-black hole. As he looked down into what felt like a bottomless abyss, he felt his stomach do a little flip. He was suddenly very, very glad that he had not promised Grant he would go down into the pit with him. Because seeing it now, up close and in person, it was terrifying. He wanted no part of going down into that thing. But Grant clearly did. His eyes were bright with excitement. He was in his element. So Michael and Grant continued the process of getting Grant all set up. And then, eventually, when Grant was fully rigged and ready to go, Michael heard a strange sound. It was the sound of something heavy sliding off a rock. And then, just moments later, that sound was followed by a loud, echoing thud that seemed to come from deep, deep inside the hole, from the bottom of the warm-up pit. For a brief moment, Michael was just confused. He didn't know what he had just heard. Maybe it was just a loose rock that had tumbled into the pit. But then he looked over at Grant. Grant had a very unhappy expression on his face, and he was staring at the ground right next to the edge of the pit. He was looking at the spot where their backpack had been sitting just a second ago. The backpack with all of their extra equipment inside? At least, the equipment they weren't currently using. And the backpack was no longer there. It was gone. The backpack had just fallen 125 feet straight down into the pit. Now, obviously, this was not good. The last thing they wanted was for their backpack to be at the bottom of that hole. But it was actually much worse than just potentially losing some of their equipment. Because inside of that bag was the only cell phone they had brought with them into the cave. And it was also where they had stored all of their extra ropes and other essential climbing gear. They had taken some things out, of course, to get Grant rigged up for his descent, but losing that bag felt really, really bad. Without the contents of that backpack, they could easily get stranded or trapped deep inside of this cave, and they wouldn't be able to call or text anyone for help. They would be completely stuck. And so Michael could feel a wave of panic starting to wash over him. But then Grant cut in. He played it cool, as he always did. He just looked at the group and said, "Look, it's no big deal." He would just go down there and get it. I mean, he was already planning on going into the hole anyway, and he was all rigged up and ready to go after all. So he would simply go down, retrieve the bag, and come back up. It would be fine. And then, before Michael or Grant's girlfriend, Carrie, or any of the other friends could say a word, Grant just strapped on his harness and a pair of ascenders. Ascenders are climbing tools that would help him move down the rope in a controlled, measured way. He began positioning himself at the edge of the pit, preparing to go down. Michael just watched Grant in complete awe. Grant was so confident, so in control, that he was able to make everyone else around him feel calm too. And Michael felt his own panic starting to subside just from watching Grant's unshakable demeanor. This wasn't the first time Grant had projected such calm in the face of danger. During Grant's freshman year of college, he had casually climbed up the entire exterior of one of their school's tallest dormitories just to see if he could do it. And he did. He had also joined the school's ROTC program, which is a military reserve training program, and as part of that, he had learned how to jump out of airplanes. So he had skydived, another one of his thrill-seeking activities. This moment here in the cave seemed like yet another perfect example of why Grant was such an incredible and natural leader. And as Michael watched him, he found himself hoping that by the time he potentially took over as president of the fellowship, he could be just as fearless, just as composed as Grant. But for now, Michael just watched as Grant very calmly lowered himself into the hole. And then he disappeared into the abyss below. For the next few minutes, it was very quiet in the cavern. All Michael could hear was the constant rushing sound of the nearby waterfall. So he and Carrie and the others just talked quietly amongst themselves. They waited for Grant to call back up to let them know that he had made it to the bottom and had successfully grabbed the backpack. And finally, they did hear Grant's voice. He did call out from somewhere deep down in that hole. But Michael couldn't really understand what Grant was saying. The waterfall that was blasting away nearby was really loud, and it created a lot of noise. And on top of that, Grant's voice echoed strangely around the stone walls of the cave, which made it almost impossible to tell what he was trying to say. So at this point, Michael and Carrie and the others, they weren't worried yet. They just figured this was an acoustics problem, not a safety problem. So Michael just walked over to the edge of the pit, and he leaned over carefully, trying to look down. But it was no use. He couldn't see Grant. He was too far down, and it was far too dark. And so Michael called out, asking Grant to repeat himself, explaining that they couldn't understand what he was saying from up there. And Grant did yell back. He clearly replied to Michael's call. But Michael still couldn't really make out the words. However, this time, there was something really different about the way Grant sounded. Again, even though he didn't know what Grant was saying, one thing was suddenly definitely clear. Grant no longer sounded like the calm, cool, and collected, fearless leader that he normally was. He was talking really, really fast. He was repeating himself. He was saying something over and over again very, very quickly with a sense of extreme urgency. And even though, again, it wasn't clear what the words were, the tone was unmistakable. Grant was scared. There was a problem. Now, obviously, problems can and do arise when you're rappelling into a 125-foot hole deep underground inside a cave. That can happen. But for Michael and the others, when they finally processed that something was seriously wrong for Grant, it was truly shocking. I mean, Grant is the guy that gets other people out of problems. He was the calm guy. Nothing ever rattled him. And so to hear him basically panicking, it was deeply unsettling for those of them standing at the surface. And so Michael and the others, they're kind of hit with this sudden dual realization. One, it's very unsettling to hear Grant sounding this way. But worse, two, is the fact that they are not cavers. They can't go into this pit and save Grant if he needs saving. Not only because they completely lacked the experience, but also because all the caving gear, all the climbing equipment was in that backpack that had fallen into the pit. It was down there with Grant. So there was no way they could realistically help him if he was in any sort of trouble down there. And also, their one and only cell phone was down there in that backpack in the pit as well. And so, unless Grant could somehow figure out whatever problem he was having and get himself back up to the surface on his own, Michael and the others knew, without even having to say it out loud, that they were completely and utterly helpless. And so, as this grim realization is setting in for Michael and the other friends, Grant goes from trying to talk to them, even though, again, they can't tell what he's saying, he just sounds panicked, to straight up screaming. He is screaming for them. Something is horribly, horribly wrong. And so Michael and Carrie, they start yelling down to Grant, trying desperately to get him to clarify what's going on. But you have this powerful waterfall that's causing all this noise and splashing water everywhere. It's dark. And Grant clearly is so panicked that he's not even listening to them anymore. And so it's just chaos. It's madness. And so Michael and Carrie, they turn to the other two friends that are with them. And they tell them, look, we're going to stay right here at this hole and wait for Grant. You two need to leave the cave right now. Go get help. And so the other two friends, they rushed off to do just that, disappearing back into the darkness of the tunnel. While Michael and Carrie just sat there by the edge of the pit, listening to Grant getting more and more hysterical by the second, somewhere far down in that black hole, they still had no idea what was wrong. But clearly, there was a major emergency happening. And so, for a little while after their friends had gone off to find help, Michael and Carrie, even though they're not really having a conversation with Grant because he's just kind of rambling and yelling and screaming and they still can't understand him, they're just kind of shouting down into the hole. They're yelling things like, everything's going to be okay. We've sent for help. It's going to be okay. You're going to get out of here soon. They had no idea if he could even hear them or understand what they were saying. They were just assuming that the acoustics were just as bad for him down there as they were for them up here. Again, the sound of that waterfall was so incredibly loud. It was so dark. And so they're just having this awful, helpless moment. But then something cut through all of that chaos. At some point, Michael heard Grant say something that he really did understand. Grant, at some point, in a very high-pitched, almost screaming voice, yelled out Michael's name. It was like he was directly yelling to Michael a clear and desperate plea. I need you, Michael, to help me. Now, at this point, obviously, the situation has escalated dramatically. Things were already bad, but for Michael, this felt like a huge deal. I mean, before that, all the yelling and screaming was obviously terrible, but Michael, he kind of views himself as Grant's potential successor. He's going to be the next president of this fellowship. And he looked up to Grant so much, primarily because Grant was this fearless, capable leader. And so Michael sort of felt like when he heard his own name called out so clearly that Grant was specifically sort of challenging him. You, Michael, I need you. Michael took on that responsibility in that instant. And he felt like, I can't just sit here. I can't just wait for help to arrive. Something needs to be done right now, and I need to be the one to do it. I need to save Grant. And so Michael, he jumped up and he grabbed the extra harness they still had with them and he started to put it on. And as he was doing that, he could hear Carrie, who, she's seeing what's happening and she's telling him, don't do it. You don't know what you're doing. You don't know how to go down this thing. Like, this is dangerous. What are you doing? Don't go. And Michael, he just looked at her and he said, I have to do this. I know Grant would do this for me. I'm doing it for him. He needs me. I'm going down. And Michael, he's listening to Carrie, who is still trying to tell him not to go, but he just said to her, please pray for me. And then he walked over to the edge of the pit and he attached his harness to the very same rope that Grant presumably was still attached to somewhere down at the bottom, but stuck for some reason. And into the pit he went. As soon as Michael disappeared down into that hole, Carrie knelt down beside the pit. She put her hands together and she prayed as hard as she possibly could for both Michael and Grant to be okay. And after a few minutes, she heard Michael call out from somewhere in the hole. And for some reason, she could actually understand what Michael was saying. He called out that he and Grant were okay. He was with Grant, but they were just very, very cold. Relief flooded over Carrie. And as she exhaled all the tension she'd been holding in her body, and as the adrenaline kind of began to leave her system because now she's thinking everything is okay, she also realized that she too was very cold. She just hadn't been thinking about it before. She had been so fixated on the safety of her boyfriend and also of Michael. After all, she was only wearing a t-shirt and the cave was very damp and there's this waterfall constantly spraying a mist of cold water everywhere. It was a cold, damp environment. And so her teeth are chattering too. She's cold. And so Carrie naturally yelled down into this hole. She can't see them, of course. She's just yelling into the darkness, what's going on? What's wrong? Is Grant okay? But Michael just shouted back to her, I'm fine. I'm fine. But he didn't answer her question about Grant. And at this, Carrie could tell that clearly there is something really wrong down there, and it probably has something to do with Grant. And so she stood up. She began pacing back and forth anxiously. Her stomach is in knots. And she's periodically yelling down into the hole to Michael, like, what's going on? Is Grant okay? Are you okay? But Michael, all he would say back to her is, I'm fine. I'm fine. He would just repeat that back to her. But his response time began to slow down. He wasn't responding to each and every one of her calls. He would just, occasionally yell out, I'm fine. I'm fine. I'm fine. But the responses just began to become more and more spaced out as Carrie began to ramp up her questioning, asking more and more, what's going on? Until finally, Michael just stopped answering altogether. There were no more voices coming out of the hole. And so, the minutes ticked by, and Carrie, she continued to pace around the edge of the pit, yelling out to Michael and Grant. But the only reply she got was the sound of the water from the waterfall lapping up against the cold cave walls. About an hour and a half later, just before 4 o'clock in the afternoon, a man named Anmar Mirza, along with 2 other men, ran into Ellison Cave, carrying a large bag filled with climbing equipment and medical supplies. Now, there was a bigger team of professional rescue workers on their way up the mountain behind them. That team had more gear and more personnel, but that group was moving much more slowly. It takes time to respond to a cave accident, because typically there are a lot of people and a lot of specialized equipment that is required. And also, usually, the victims are trapped in pretty remote and difficult to access places, like deep tunnels and narrow shafts deep inside of these caves. So Anmar and his 2-man team were the initial smaller group that went in ahead of the larger one, just to kind of get the rescue started as quickly as possible. A few minutes after entering the cave, Anmar saw a headlamp beam up ahead in the darkness, kind of bobbing around erratically. And as soon as he reached the origin of this light, he found a young woman. She was sitting by a large hole in the ground, and she was shaking and absolutely terrified. She explained that her name was Carrie, and that her boyfriend, whose name was Grant, along with one of his friends, whose name was Michael, were down in this hole. She told him that Grant had gone in first, there had been some kind of issue, and then Michael had gone in after him to help. And now, when she called out for them, neither one of them were responding. After hearing this, Anmar directed one of his team members to take Carrie and bring her safely out of the cave. And then, once they had left, Anmar put on his own climbing gear. And as soon as he was ready, he began to rappel down into the pit. As Anmar rappelled, he's looking straight down into this dark shaft. And at first, he can't see anything at all. But after a little while, he began to see, somewhere far down below, what appeared to be 2 small lights towards the bottom of the pit, which he correctly assumed belonged to the 2 missing men. But before he could actually reach them, he felt something wet and freezing cold splash against his cheek. Then he saw something emerge out of the darkness, right below him. It would turn out, when Grant had rappelled down into the warm-up pit, he had made a terrible, terrible mistake. He had attached his rigging, his main rope, to a section of rock that was directly in the path of a freezing cold waterfall. Now, this alone could have been okay. You can rappel effectively through a waterfall if you're careful and you move quickly. Except what happened with Grant is, as he was rappelling literally through the flowing water, like the water is coming off this waterfall and it's hitting him directly, he got stuck. His rope got tangled, and the spot where he got stuck was literally in the direct path of the waterfall. So, he's stuck in the cave. he can't go up. He can't go down. And he's just getting pounded by a constant stream of freezing cold water. Now, at first, what Grant likely did is kind of flail around trying desperately to get out of the path of this water, but there was nowhere to go. He's in this narrow vertical shaft. There's nowhere to move, and he's just dangling there. And he began trying to scream out for help. But that was why his words were so muffled. The water was hitting him in the face, making it impossible for him to speak clearly. And then also, as he's just dangling there very, very quickly, having that icy water hitting him nonstop would have sent his body into shock. It's like he wouldn't have been able to speak or even think anymore. He was rapidly becoming hypothermic. And then, in what was possibly one of his final moments of clarity, he managed to belt out Michael's name. He said it really clearly. He must have managed to get his face out of the direct path of the water for just a second. And Michael, who trusted Grant completely, when he heard his name being called, it felt like it was his personal calling. He felt he needed to go in there and save Grant himself. And so, into the hole he went. And he hooked his own rope up into the same exact spot that Grant had used. And down he went. And Michael, he did an incredibly brave thing by doing this. And it was something that Grant very likely would have done for him too. But again, Michael really had no idea what he was doing. He was basically just going in blind. However, unfortunately, because he just kind of followed Grant's lead and went down there without a plan, well, in the darkness, as he went down, he eventually reached the spot where Grant was, but he got stuck as well. Also, in the path of the waterfall. Granted, he was not nearly as exposed to the water as Grant was. Like his face was not getting blasted by water, so he was able to call out and be heard by Carrie at least for a little while. But he also got tangled at the same spot. He couldn't move. His body was getting hit by this icy water. And so even though the rescuers did eventually get down to Michael and Grant, by the time they did, it was too late. The two young men had frozen to death. They had basically dangled inside of that hole, getting hit by that freezing water for about 2 hours before their bodies just completely shut down. In 2013, 2 years after both Michael and Grant died inside of that cave, the Carnegie Hero Fund Commission gave Michael a posthumous medal for risking his own life in an attempt to save Grant's. On a Friday night in late March of 1980, an 83-year-old man named Harry R. Truman sat on his couch in his remote Washington State lodge. He had a glass of whiskey and Coke in his hand, and he turned on his battery-operated radio to listen to the news. Just a second or two later, he found himself having to jack up the volume on the radio because he couldn't hear it anymore. A couple of his cats were fighting in the other room, yowling and hissing, and it was causing a whole commotion. Harry had lost track of how many cats he actually had living with him, but it was a lot. Maybe a dozen or so. And even though at this particular moment he yelled and cursed at them and told them to knock it off, he was actually glad they were out there with him. He liked their company. 5 years earlier, Harry's beloved wife Edna had died. And ever since then, he had lived completely alone, minus all of these cats. And he also didn't have a lot of neighbors to speak of either. So, for the most part, he had been fairly isolated for the last few years. Also, Spirit Lake, the beautiful lake that his lodge was situated on, was a 4-hour drive south of the major city of Seattle. It was pretty far out there, deep in the wilderness. The lake did get busy during the summer months with tourists and campers, but at this time in March, there were only about 60 people that lived there year-round, and they were all very spread out. But Harry didn't really mind the solitude. He missed Edna a lot, of course, but he had his cats, and he had his radio, and he had the jaw-dropping mountain scenery and the lake right outside his door. And he had his whiskey and cokes. So overall, even though he was sort of a gruff, cantankerous guy, he was actually quite happy with his life. But just then, there was a loud knock on Harry's front door. And Harry was not surprised by this. I mean, yes, he lived way out in the middle of nowhere, and he did not normally expect visitors. But in this case, he knew exactly who it was. And as soon as he thought about that, his face contorted into a deep scowl. He was really annoyed. At this point in Harry's life, he really only had one problem. And it was a major problem, at least to him. And that was the government. For the last few days, government agents, like almost certainly the ones that were knocking on his door right now, had been harassing him. They were trying to get him to leave his lodge, to abandon the home in the wilderness that he loved so much. They said they needed to conduct some kind of federal operation, and they wanted everybody in the area to clear out. Now, Harry loved his country. He had even fought for it during the First World War. But he really did not like authority, and he could not tolerate being told what to do. During Prohibition, for example, which was a period of time in the 1920s when alcohol was illegal in America, Harry had simply ignored the law completely and made his own booze. He just didn't care about their rules. So, over these last few days, as these federal agents had come to his house trying to get him to leave, Harry had not been intimidated in the slightest. He had simply stood his ground. And he figured it was really only a matter of time before the federal government sent a local police officer over in the hopes that Harry would be more cooperative with somebody that he likely already knew. But what they didn't know about Harry is that Harry really didn't cooperate with anybody. Not with the government, and certainly not with local police. Not with his own family, not with his friends, and not with the 2 ex-wives he'd been with before he found Edna. He was just somebody who marched to the beat of his own drum. Always. So now, Harry did not get up to answer the knock at his door. Instead, he just waited until the person out there, the visitor, yelled through the door and announced who they were. And not really to Harry's surprise, it was the local deputy, a man that Harry did know. He was clearly being sent here by the federal agents to try one more time to get Harry to leave. And when Harry still didn't answer the door, even after the deputy had clearly announced himself knowing that Harry would recognize his voice, when Harry still didn't get up, didn't answer the door, the deputy finally, just sort of frustrated, called out, "Harry, are you sure you don't want to go?" Now, even though this deputy was being a whole lot more amicable than the government agents had been, they had been really forceful, basically telling him, "You've got to leave." The deputy here was at least kind of giving Harry a chance to make a decision for himself. Despite that, the question the deputy had asked just made Harry really mad. Because leaving his house was just not something he would ever consider doing. Harry had lived in this lodge for 54 years. And 37 of those years were spent running this lodge as an inn, as a business, with his late wife Edna, who was the love of his life. So they were definitely still on the list. And her fiancé, Kurt, was highly educated, so he was still a possibility as well. Shepard wasn't sure about Phil Hartman, the coworker Kem had accused of sexual harassment. He had managed to reach Phil by phone that morning, and Phil had told him he was working in Louisiana at the time the bomb went off, hundreds of miles away. But Shepard knew that just being physically far away from the bomb when it detonated was not a perfect alibi anymore, not with a motion-activated device. The killer could have placed it days before and then traveled. But still, Louisiana was a really long way away. And as far as Shepard could tell, Phil didn't seem to have any kind of technical background. So Phil was still on the list, but he was moving down it. As Shepard stood there in the blackened, destroyed foyer, looking at the partially burned pages of Modern Bride magazines that had been blown all over the room, he thought about the fact that whoever had done this had to have been very comfortable in Kem's house. They had gotten inside the house at some point, and then they had clearly spent a good amount of time in the basement tinkering with the bomb. Then they came upstairs and were in the foyer, setting the thing up. This was someone who was incredibly confident that they were not going to get caught doing all of this inside the house. That was some serious boldness. And so, Shepard was starting to feel pretty certain that whoever had done this was either a family member or someone so close to Kem that they might as well have been family. Shepard left Kem's house, his mind already planning his next steps. He was thinking about how he could get search warrants for both Dale and Todd's workplaces to see if any of the machinery or tools they used there shared parts with the bomb. But as he stepped off the final front step and onto the sidewalk, he heard a voice call out his name from behind him. He turned to see another Bloomington police officer jogging over towards him. The bombing had created a real sense of panic, not just in Bloomington, but all across the state of Illinois. People were now terrified that a bomb was going to show up on their own front porch. They were seeing packages they didn't recognize and calling the police, convinced that they could be explosives. It was like a wave of paranoia had swept over the state. In response to that, specifically in Bloomington, the police had a much stronger and more visible presence out on the street. And Shepard had also asked his officers to re-canvass Kem's neighborhood to go back and question all the neighbors again now that they knew more about the bomb itself. Specifically, they now knew that the bomb was motion activated. This meant the bomber did not need to be there right before it went off. They could have been in the house building the bomb days before. They could have planted the bomb well in advance of the bombing itself. So there was a much bigger window of time now. They were asking the neighbors different questions. It's a very important and very surprising leverage over the authorities. And that was that over the past couple of days, Harry's stubborn refusal to leave his wilderness home just because the government told him to had turned him into a media attraction. Reporters had heard about what was going on, and they had started coming all the way out to his house to talk to him. Now, usually, Harry just did not like the press. Even though he clearly listened to the news himself, he still thought of the press, thought of the media like they were vultures, always just looking for dead meat and chaos. But Harry also really, really liked to talk, and he had a lot of very strong opinions. And now, seeing his beautiful lake inundated by all these outsiders, Harry realized he had to take full advantage of this media interest in him if he wanted to have any chance of staying in his home. Because the way he saw it was, the government could not really make him do anything against his will if the whole world was watching. So, over the next month, Harry gave a lot of interviews. And pretty quickly, he became kind of an international celebrity. He was this single, older man standing up to something way bigger and way more powerful than himself, which was sort of admirable. Although people didn't really understand why he was doing it, it was still a big story. It was very interesting. But more than that, it seemed like the public just sort of liked Harry. In his interviews, Harry would swear and yell and rant and rave and tell reporters about how no authority figure would dare try to get him out of his house. He famously said, "No, I'm not going to leave. You're damn right I'm not going to leave. I'm going to stay here." Damn right they're things. They left behind some random supplies in the basement, but they figured it didn't really matter, since the explosion would destroy all the evidence anyway. Feeling very confident in their work, telling these crazy stories that had nothing to do with the wilderness, like about the whiskey that he bottled and distilled himself during his Prohibition days, which he called panthropy, and about his relationship with his late wife Edna and how they used to dance together right at the edge of the lake. Or his war stories from World War I. I mean, this guy was just really quite fascinating. And so, by the time May rolled around that year, Harry went from being bombarded by the government to being bombarded by the media. Today, this would be like going crazy viral, where everybody's seeing you on their feed. But this was 1980, and so people got their news from newspapers and the television and the radio. But those mediums were all full of Harry Truman, and people were kind of obsessed. Everybody from average citizens to school kids sent Harry fan mail. Reporters and news crews came to Harry's in droves, and some even took helicopters just to get there more quickly. And Harry, if he was being honest with himself, he sort of relished all the attention. A few months earlier, he'd been perfectly happy with his quiet life. He had no phone, and he just had his 1,000 cats for company. But now, it was like the whole world cared about him, and it was pretty cool. A few weeks later, though, everything changed. On Sunday, May 18th, the sun came up on Harry's lodge, and the woods around it were totally quiet for the first time in weeks. Because Harry, in some ways, had won. He had kept his word, and he'd stayed strong, and refused to give in to the government's demands to leave. And finally, the government had backed down. The sheriff had even come by the day before to tell Harry that, okay, no one's going to come by and ask you to leave anymore. It's on you. And so now, on May 18th, as Harry was getting up, it was just him, the lake, the trees, and the big, beautiful mountain. And then, at 8:32 in the morning, a deafening boom shook the earth. It would turn out the media was not totally finished with the story of Harry R. Truman. In fact, what happened on the morning of May 18th, 1980, would in many ways make Harry even more famous than he already was. Because Harry didn't live at the base of just any old mountain. His lodge was situated directly at the foot of Mount St. Helens, which was an active volcano. The government operation that the federal agents and local law enforcement were trying to run here was an evacuation. They were not trying to impede on Harry's rights as a citizen. They were trying to save his life. But Harry was so convinced that the land he loved so much, the land that he had lived on for nearly 60 years, would not hurt him. And so he ignored the authorities' repeated and urgent warnings. But Harry's decision was the wrong one. And on May 18th, he paid for his mistake. Because that morning, Mount St. Helens erupted, sending an avalanche of searing hot lava and mud directly onto Spirit Lake and Harry's lodge, killing him and all of his cats instantly. His remains were never found. 57 people died during this eruption, including Harry. Today, in that area, Harry has both a trail and a ridge that are named after him. So, in a way, he remains a part of the mountain that he loved so much. And in both of today's stories, the people at the center of them made choices they believed were the right ones. Grant believed he could handle the cave. Michael believed he could save his friend. Harry believed the mountain he loved would never harm him. But sometimes, confidence, loyalty, and even love can push people toward decisions they never fully realize are dangerous until it's far too late. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know which story stayed with you the most in the comments below. And if you want more true stories about strange disasters, impossible decisions, and people who found themselves in situations far beyond their control, we have an entire playlist waiting for you right now. Until next time, see ya. Barbara Rocky, 22, was sitting at her bedroom desk in Provo, Utah on the 11th of March, 1974. She was writing rapidly, almost angrily. She stopped, chewed her pen, and read her writing sometimes. It didn't satisfy her yet. She needed perfect words. She added a few lines, crossed off something, and reread it. Roommates were the recipient. Both stood at 5 feet 3 inches tall, with round faces and dark hair, which they always made sure to style in the exact same way. If one got a new haircut, the other would be in the salon the very next day getting the same one. But it went so much deeper than just their appearance. Their personalities and interests were almost perfectly mirrored to a point that it sometimes seemed deliberate, almost forced. Both were social and outgoing. Both played the piano beautifully. They sang together in the school glee club. They both got good grades. It was as if they were two halves of a single person. But then there were the things they shared that just didn't seem possible. For example, they had a strange habit of getting sick at the exact same time, even with illnesses that weren't contagious. There was one instance that Adolphus and his wife never forgot. Bobby had developed a painful abscess on one of her teeth. She was genuinely sick from it, with a fever and a swollen jaw. It was a serious infection. Then, completely out of the blue, Betty developed an abscess in the very same tooth. The doctors couldn't explain it. This wasn't something you could fake or imagine. It was a real physical ailment that she had developed at the exact same moment as her twin sister. It was just one of many examples of their strange, unexplainable connection, and on the rare occasions when some difference was forced upon them, they would work very intentionally to erase that difference and become the same again. When Bobby's eyesight started to fail and she needed glasses, she was a little self-conscious about it. Betty, whose vision was perfectly fine, begged her parents to let her get glasses too. She didn't need them, but she couldn't stand the idea of being different from her sister in any way. So, she got a pair of glasses with plain lenses, just so they could look identical again. So now, this big move to Winston-Salem was just the next chapter in their shared life. The same job, the same factory, the same room, in the same boarding house. It was how they had always done things. A part of Adolphus and his wife had secretly hoped that as they got older, Bobby and Betty might start to become a little more independent of each other. It just seemed like the healthy, natural thing to do. But as he put down that last box and looked at his two daughters, both with the same wide, excited smile on their faces, he felt a wave of gratitude. Maybe this was for the best. This was a good intermediate step. They could take this leap into adulthood together, leaning on each other. It was a bridge. After a few more minutes of helping them get settled, Adolphus knew it was time to go. He gave them both a long hug and said, "Okay, I'm going to take off now. Best of luck. I love you both. Call whenever you need anything." And with that, he walked out, got in his car, and began the quiet, lonely drive back home. Fast forward 2 years. Adolphus was at home in Pearl Lear, setting the dining room table while his wife finished cooking dinner in the kitchen. It was a weekend, and Adolphus felt that familiar sense of happy anticipation. For the past 2 years, without fail, Bobby and Betty had driven home from Winston-Salem every single weekend to visit. It was the highlight of the week for Adolphus and his wife. They cherished this time with their daughters, hearing all about their jobs and their new lives. Just as Adolphus placed the last dinner plate on the table, he heard a knock at the front door. He smiled to himself. Right on time. "They're here," he called to his wife. He walked to the door, ready to greet both of his girls, but when he opened it, he was surprised. It was just Bobby. Betty was nowhere in sight. He looked past her, toward the driveway, expecting to see Betty getting out of the car. He asked, "Where's Betty? Is she in the car?" Bobby just shook her head and said no. That's when Adolphus noticed that Bobby had luggage with her, a couple of suitcases, and she looked terribly sad. Her usual bright expression was gone, replaced by a look of deep unhappiness, almost depression. "Bobby, what's going on?" he asked, his heart starting to sink. She looked down at the ground and said quietly, "I hated my job at the factory. I hated it. So I quit. I'm coming home." Adolphus was stunned. This was a huge shift. The twins did everything together. They always had. Even if one of them wasn't particularly interested in something, she would usually go along with it just to maintain their sameness. The idea that one would quit this big new life they had built together while the other stayed was a massive departure from their entire history. Adolphus tried to process it. "And Betty?" he asked. "She doesn't hate her job. She's going to stay. She's going to keep working at the factory and living there." The news was jarring. But then he shifted focus back to the immediate situation. "Okay, well, of course you can stay here. Of course you can come home. But where's Betty? Is she coming to visit this weekend? Even if she's still working, she's still coming for the weekend, right?" Again, Bobby shook her head. "No. She's staying in Winston-Salem this weekend." This was another shock. They had never missed a weekend visit. It just felt like the world had tilted on its axis. What was going on with his girls? But Adolphus pushed his confusion aside. His daughter was hurting. He put his arm around her and said, "Look, just come on in. Have some dinner. Get settled. We'll talk about this. We'll figure out what your next steps are. Of course, you can stay here. Everything will be fine." Bobby picked up her bags and stepped inside. But as her mother came out to greet her, Bobby just said she wasn't hungry and didn't want to eat. Then she walked straight up to her old bedroom, brought her things inside, and shut the door. She didn't come out again that night. And for the next 2 years, that's mostly where Bobby stayed. In her bedroom, the door was almost always closed. She rarely left the room, and when she did, it was just for brief trips to the bathroom or to get a glass of water, and then she would retreat right back into her sanctuary. She had almost completely shut down. She never explained to her parents what she hated so much about the factory job. She never talked about anything, really. The social, extroverted girl they knew had vanished. In her place was a recluse. She didn't try to reconnect with any of her old friends from high school. She didn't look for a new job or show any interest in her future. It was as if her life had just stopped. She was just existing, day after day, inside those four walls. But there was one thing that could bring the old Bobby back, if only for a little while. And that was when Betty came home to visit on the weekends. The moment Betty walked through the front door, it was like a switch was flipped. Bobby would emerge from her room, her face would light up, and she would instantly become her old self again. The two of them would fall right back into their old rhythm, laughing and talking as if no time had passed. There was no resentment, no awkwardness about the fact that their lives had taken such different paths. For those 2 days, everything was normal again. And then, Sunday evening would come, Betty would leave to go back to her job and her life in Winston-Salem, and Bobby would walk back into her bedroom and shut the door. The light would go out again. For Adolphus and his wife, it was agonizing to watch. They had always hoped their daughters would find some independence. But now it seemed that while Betty was managing to do okay on her own, Bobby was completely falling apart without her sister. She was utterly dependent on Betty for her happiness, for her very sense of self. It was so clear. Adolphus didn't know how this could ever be resolved. It just seemed to be getting worse and worse for Bobby as time went on. Then, around the 2-year mark of Bobby being home, something else unexpected happened. Betty came home one Friday for her usual weekend visit. But this time, she had luggage with her, just like Bobby had 2 years prior. She walked in and announced, "I quit the factory too. I'm moving back home." In a strange way, Adolphus and his wife felt a sense of relief. Their first thought was for Bobby. This had to be a good thing for her. With Betty home for good, surely Bobby would return to her normal self. They had seen how happy she was every time Betty visited. Maybe now that happiness would be permanent. But there was also a sense of unease. It just didn't make sense for Betty to quit her job. She seemed to like it. She seemed to be thriving on her own. Adolphus couldn't prove it, but he had a strong suspicion about what was really happening. He believed Betty was making a sacrifice. She was giving up her independent life to come home and be with her sister, to fall back into step with her just like they always did. It seemed like the only explanation. Still, the silver lining was that maybe, just maybe, their daughters would be happy and healthy again. But that is not what happened. Once Betty was back home, the two sisters did fall back in step with each other, just as their parents had predicted. But it wasn't a return to their old happy selves. Their connection, their dependence on each other, became more extreme than it had ever been before. And it had already been extreme. This was something else entirely. They both moved into Bobby's old bedroom. They went inside, shut the door, and missing for months. Hayward spotted the woman's clothes and shoes next to the body. Each item was nicely folded, which surprised him. Hayward donned latex gloves and examined the outfit. Nothing was ripped or destroyed, he saw. Hayward also remarked that the scene was as immaculate as the garments as he strolled about. No firearms was visible. No dirt marks indicated a struggle or brawl. The body showed no signs of being dragged. Hayward believed this woman was shot and died where she was found. Hayward surveyed the trail from the middle. Those nicely folded clothing could signify several things. A consenting intercourse that went violent may have erased them. The woman may have been gunned down. Hayward felt this woman's killer was someone she knew. Because getting here from the road was hard. Hayward was approaching 50 and wasn't in great shape, but even a young and fit person would struggle to force another up a steep slope like this. It made more logical that she had walked up here freely with a trusted person. After they got up here, that individual killed her without witnesses. Hayward believed his theory wasn't much until he identified this woman. It appeared she had no handbag and no ID in her folded clothes. Hayward signaled other police to help him flip her body to see below. Hayward noticed a few bullets on the dirt as they did it. The rear images showed they had gone straight through her. Hayward directed his team to photograph and bag the rounds for testing immediately. He also directed them to get some of the ground where the bullets were lodged in case it contained more evidence. In the 1970s, investigators could test garment fibers or hairs for a suspect without DNA. After giving his crew directions, Hayward breathed deeply and returned down the trail. He had to find her name. Next Wednesday, March 13, Hayward hurried down a Salt Lake City Sheriff's Office hallway to a meeting room. He was bleary-eyed and adrenaline-fueled after working this case constantly since the day before. He had just met with the ballistics expert who told him the gun that killed this woman was likely .357 caliber. Of course, this was useful for the investigation. Since .357s were plentiful, it didn't narrow things down. Hayward found something else important for the investigation. Victim's identity. Barbara Rocky was 22. Hayward's team aired the body's finding on local news the night before. After releasing that, BYU police called regarding a student who had gone missing a day earlier. Some of this missing student's friends had come to Salt Lake City to identify the deceased a few hours earlier and confirmed that it was Barbara. Hayward had previously spoken to some of the youngsters and had other officers contact Barbara's relatives. But Hayward was on his way to receive a formal statement from a young guy called Jerry Hicker. Jerry was one of the body's identifiers and reported Barbara missing initially. Hayward hoped he might help them find Barbara's killer. Hayward sat across from Jerry at a conference table minutes later. Jerry appeared rattled. He kept shaking his head and turning away, like he was trying not to cry. Hayward was a harsh interrogator. Given Jerry's clear guilt, he didn't spend time giving condolences or Kleenex. According to Barbara, he was her best school friend. Hayward believed Barbara was murdered by a trusted person. So he plainly told Jerry that he needed to know everything that transpired the day Barbara disappeared. Jerry was surprised by the bluntness. However, he took a hesitant breath and claimed that he had taken Barbara's automobile the day before and returned it at her house around 10 a.m. on Monday. He then said he spent several hours in the library. He said he'd meet Barbara. Barbara didn't show up for their later-day hangout. He found her car gone when he checked on her at home. He started walking home again when he saw her car down the block, parked outside an apartment complex he didn't understand. His assumption was that she didn't know anyone there. He stated he was walking to the car and spotted a message inside. Doorknob was open when he tried. He took the note from within and read it. He stated the note was unsettling. He suspected a suicide note. Hayward nods. He noticed the note. BYU police gave it to him. Excerpt, Barbara seemed to be informing her housemates she was leaving town to be with like-minded people. The note was cryptic, so Hayward wasn't sure what to make of it. A suicide note or a regular note could be it. He wasn't even convinced Barbara wrote the letter. Her killer may have authored the letter. Barbara's murderer may have tried to make her absence look like a suicide or a runaway in hopes that police would never uncover her body. Hayward forwarded the letter to a handwriting expert for feedback. Hayward asked Jerry about Barbara. Jerry claimed that they hung out a lot and that she gravitated toward him because she felt unwelcome at school and with her housemates, who didn't like her since she wasn't religious. Jerry also told Hayward that Barbara had exacerbated her roommates' disagreement by shouting sacrilegious things to frighten them. He said there was so much tension between them that he tried to find Barbara a new place to live. This cheered Hayward. The possibility of Barbara's domestic struggle seemed intriguing. Even though a group of young, devout Mormon ladies were unlikely murder suspects, it was worth investigating. One of them may have snapped and tried to injure Barbara after being scared by her mocking. Hayward stood up and informed Jerry he could leave because he had no more questions. He wasn't ready to rule out anyone, but Jerry seemed doubtful. He reported Barbara missing and had an alibi for sections of the day. Given that her body was recovered in a remote region by chance, the killer would have been better off keeping quiet and hoping it was never found. Why would Jerry call the police if he was the killer? It was illogical. Hayward left to hassle officers. They needed to speak with Barbara's roommates in Provo. 2 days after Barbara's death was located in the canyon, Hayward drove to a Salt Lake City pawn shop the next afternoon. Because so much had transpired in the last 24 hours, he was exhausted even more than yesterday. They contacted Barbara's relatives, who were upset, but they had no useful information for the investigation. They didn't know Barbara's friends or school life, so they couldn't say if somebody wanted to hurt her. No one knew if she planned to leave campus. Apparently, she was, since the handwriting expert returned to verify the note. Written by Barbara. If read literally, the note was about her true plans to depart. Hayward thought the letter from Barbara should be interpreted literally after speaking to Jerry, who had talked about the tension between Barbara and her roommates and how she didn't fit in, and after speaking to all 7 of Barbara's roommates, who all admitted they didn't like Barbara. She only wanted to leave university and her roommates. But the roommates had good explanations for Barbara's disappearance. Hayward had to eliminate the housemates for now. Hayward was unconcerned since the roommates had given him another lead. One roommate said Barbara wanted to pawn her Salt Lake City turquoise necklace before she left. Hayward and other cops spent the day searching local pawn shops to discover if she had done it. Hayward hadn't located the necklace or Barbara's pawn store yet. But aside from this jewelry lead, the investigation was losing pace, so he felt hopeful, maybe too hopeful. They had searched and fingerprinted Barbara's car, but discovered nothing substantial. The returned autopsy was basically useless. The medical examiner found 5 gunshot wounds, more than Hayward expected. But they couldn't confirm Barbara's sexual assault. The forensics analysis showed no fingerprints from the crime scene. Hayward entered this pawn store with all of this in his brain. He asked the cashier if she bought a turquoise necklace. To Hayward's surprise, the woman answered, yes. She then pointed to a glass case behind the counter where a long white necklace with turquoise stones was sitting on a red felt pad. After 30 minutes, Hayward was back in his cruiser, his heart racing and his mind running so quickly he couldn't focus. Because Hayward finally had a trail. Barbara fit the shop clerk's description of the turquoise necklace seller. Additionally, the shopkeeper had a sale ticket showing Barbara was at the store on March 11th at 12:50 p.m., the day she disappeared. The most amazing part of this fresh lead was that Barbara informed this clerk she was in a hurry because her lover was circling the block outside. This was significant because Hayward and his crew had interviewed many people in Barbara's life, and none had indicated a lover. Unfortunately, the pawnshop worker had not seen Barbara's boyfriend. After taking the necklace and receipt as evidence, Hayward rushed back to the precinct to make calls. He wanted to know if Barbara's friends knew about this boyfriend but hadn't said it. A deputy stopped Hayward when he parked his car and ran into the precinct. The deputy seemed as excited and stressed as Hayward. The deputy told Hayward he wouldn't believe this, but they were continuing their background interviews, and Barbara's acquaintances indicated she had mentioned Richard, her lover. This was excellent for Hayward. Exactly this information was his goal. The deputy was upset because she had a boyfriend, not this. He said Richard was Richard Finder, a California psychic who was in town on a ski holiday when Barbara was killed. They knew that because Richard had called the station unexpectedly to offer help. A few hours later, Hayward sat across from 30-year-old Richard Finder in interrogation. Richard, with spectacles and a goatee, appeared confident and eager to help. Hayward felt like he was acting. He believed Richard killed Barbara. After all, murderers often entered murder investigations to see what was going on and divert culpability. Hayward believed Richard was ringing in to offer his psychic skills. Hayward had spent the last 2 hours investigating Richard. He also found his .357 pistol, which killed Barbara. He also discovered that Richard was staying in Salt Lake City near Barbara's body in Big Cottonwood Canyon. Way too many coincidences. Hayward was ready to be brutal with Richard to get a confession. But Hayward answered some background questions first. Richard revealed that Barbara met him after hearing him on the radio. He said they'd never been physical but had a profound spiritual relationship. After that, Hayward directly asked Richard why he contacted the station. Richard became serious and stated he needed to come forward because he had a sense about Barbara's fate. He said he was a psychic and had a vision that the murder weapon was tossed in water. Hayward couldn't believe his ears. Since the cops hadn't reported the murder weapon missing, He knew they were hunting for the murder weapon, but Richard shouldn't have. Thus, Hayward did not inquire further regarding his vision. Instead, he asked that Richard account for every hour of his day on March 11, Barbara's disappearance. Richard seemed truly confused for the first time. He glanced at Hayward in disbelief. Afterward, he denied killing Barbara. "Not possible," he said. He spent all day with buddies. Hayward frowned at Richard and handed him a pad of paper to write down his friend's information for follow-up. As he watched Richard quickly write down names and numbers, Hayward knew this was their guy. The circumstantial evidence against him was overwhelming. He understood they needed more evidence to arrest. Thus, Hayward would first verify Richard's alibi and then test his 357 against Barbara's murder bullets. So he informed Richard he could go for now, but they needed to check his gun. A few weeks later, Hayward sat at his sheriff's office desk staring at Richard's gun ballistics. Barbara was slain by something other than a gun. Hayward couldn't recall being more startled and disappointed. He identified Richard as the killer. Richard, his sole suspect, was great. After checking his alibi, it didn't hold up. His pals answered, "Well, we were with him, but not the whole day. So Richard was missing for major parts of the day she went missing." Hayward grumbled and reminded himself that Richard wasn't innocent just because his gun wasn't a match. It's conceivable he used another 357 and then abandoned it. However, Hayward couldn't believe that over the course of a whole year, the average temperature across the entirety of Siberia is consistently rather close to freezing. Because it can reach temperatures that are unfathomable throughout the winter, it is considered to be one of the coldest spots on the globe where people live. Moreover, the weather is not the only thing that is attempting to take your life. Just as daunting is the wildlife that can be found in Siberia. The grizzly bears that are found in North America are of the same species as the enormous brown bears that you have. Gray wolves can be found in packs, and some of them can grow to reach almost 200 pounds in weight, making them dwarf any other wolves you could encounter in other places. And then there is the Siberian tiger, which is a predator that is both extremely intelligent and extremely powerful. One of the few creatures on Earth that has been documented to intentionally hunt humans, sometimes even for vengeance, these tigers are among the few that have been known to do so. There is a well-known tale that dates back to 1997 about a hunter who accidentally shot and injured a Siberian tiger. This tiger did not pass away. As an alternative, it followed the hunter all the way back to his cabin, waited for him to emerge from the building, and then proceeded to murder and consume him. As you might have guessed, the number of people who choose to reside in Siberia is relatively low. Given the enormous extent of the area, the population is extremely small. On the other hand, for a particular category of individuals, the very same traits that scare away the majority of people are the precise things that attract them. Siberia is one of the few truly wild areas on Earth, and it is a final frontier that needs to be experienced by those who are interested in taking on new challenges and traveling. Additionally, a young man from the United States by the name of Colin Madsen was one of these daring individuals. Growing up in Missouri, Colin was a member of a family that was both prosperous and caring. Since he was a little boy, he had a deep fascination with the natural world. He enjoyed going on hikes, camping, and simply being outside in the greenery. When he was younger, he began reading about Siberia at some time in his life. After looking at photographs of its wild and unspoiled beauty, he became utterly enthralled by the place. What he was interested in was not merely a passing curiosity. In the depths of it, he dove. He started learning about the history of Russia and Siberia, and he even taught himself how to speak Russian well. It wasn't enough for him to simply travel to Siberia. He wanted to live there and completely submerge himself in the culture. Furthermore, in the year 2013, when Colin was 22 years old, he was able to turn his desire into success. Irkutsk, which is located in the middle of the world, became his new home after he packed his belongings, said his goodbyes to his family in Missouri, and went there. Irkutsk is one of the few large population concentrations in the southeast region of Siberia, and it is situated directly on the shore of Lake Baikal. The natural wonder that is Lake Baikal is, in and of itself, it is the freshwater lake that is both the oldest and the deepest in the world. It is so deep and clear that in certain areas you can see more than 100 feet below the surface. The idea that Colin had for his new life in Siberia was straightforward but nonetheless grandiose. In order to further his education, he would enroll in a university, and in his leisure time he would spend it exploring the wilderness that he had fantasized about for such a long time. Moreover, over a period of time, everything proceeded precisely in accordance with that plan. As soon as he was accepted into the local branch of Moscow State Linguistic University in Irkutsk, he was able to immediately form a group of friends who shared his enthusiasm for the great outdoors. It was a group of individuals who, just like him, were anxious to explore the immense wilderness that was Siberia. The life that Colin had always desired was the life that he had from the time he came in 2013 until the year 2016. Not only did he excel in his academic pursuits, but he also enthusiastically spent endless weekends and holidays going on hikes and camping in the mountains and forests that encircled Lake Baikal. In addition, he was not only a tourist who went hiking for fun. After gaining such a deep understanding of the area and becoming proficient in negotiating its difficult terrain, he decided to begin working for a local group that was dedicated to charitable causes. Their objective was to establish and label new hiking paths so that others might enjoy them in a secure environment. As a result, Colin was essentially venturing into undiscovered area, so paving the way for new routes through the Siberian wilderness. In a setting where there was very little room for error, he was a knowledgeable individual who was regarded for his abilities and his composed approach to surviving in the environment. Because of this, when his family received the news in 2016 about what had occurred to him, it was something that they simply were unable to comprehend. In the month of March in the year 2016, Colin and 3 of his closest hiking companions came to the conclusion that it was time for new adventures. As well as being an American, one of the pals was also Russian, and the other 2 were American. In the same way as Colin was, all of them were seasoned outdoor enthusiasts. Following the examination of maps, they settled on a destination, which turned out to be the peak of a mountain that was referred to as Love Peak. They were a few hours' drive away from their home base in Irkutsk, which was located in a little settlement named Arshan. Love Peak was located there. Now, when compared to other hikes in Siberia, this one was not particularly challenging at all. There were some steep sections on the trail that led up to the peak, but it was fairly well defined and had been walked quite a bit. Every single one of the 4 men, including Colin, had hiked it on multiple occasions in the past. It was a trip that was both familiar and reasonably risk-free. Being seasoned hikers in Siberia, however, meant that they were aware of one thing above all others: you should never show disrespect to the natural environment. Without proper preparation, even the most straightforward hike could turn out to be fatal. Anywhere could be a potential danger. As a result, they were very serious about their preparations. In order to rent a tiny rustic cabin at the foot of the mountain, the intention was to drive to Arshan and make the trip there. Using this cottage as their base camp would be their plan. Before beginning their ascent early the following morning, it would provide them with a location to get themselves organized, check their equipment, and get a full night's sleep the night before. Therefore, they made a reservation in advance for one of the cute tiny cabins that were tucked away in the woods and were located close to the trailhead. A few days later, on the morning of March 27th, Colin and his 3 friends began the journey to the village of Arshan by embarking on a westbound journey from Irkutsk. They packed their car with all of their equipment and supplies and began their journey. Upon their arrival, they made a brief detour at a nearby store to purchase some water and food for the last minute, and then they proceeded to make their way to the cabin that they had leased. Exactly as they had anticipated, it was a straightforward location. It was essentially a single room with a few beds, which was just enough to provide refuge from the chilly environmental conditions of Siberia. Inside, there was no plumbing available. In the event that you required the use of the restroom, there was a modest outhouse located a short distance away from the cabin. The four companions made themselves comfortable, claimed their mattresses, and immediately began arranging their belongings in preparation for the hike that would take place the next day. They continued to converse, eat, and simply take pleasure in each other's presence as they sat around. The atmosphere was upbeat and full of excitement for the ascent that was still to come. They came to a conclusion regarding their strategy, which stated that they would get up at 5 in the morning to complete their last preparations, with the intention of getting on the route and climbing to the summit of Love Peak no later than 7 o'clock. They were well aware that in order to make that happen, they needed to get some rest. Therefore, at 2 in the morning, they ensured that the lights in the cabin were turned out, and then all four of their companions went to bed. It was precisely 5 o'clock in the morning when the alarms went off, which was 3 hours later. At that moment, one of the companions reached over and turned on the light in the cabin. And, at that particular moment, it was manifestly obvious that something was extremely, extremely wrong. He was not in his bed at the time. It was not until later that there was a feeling of panic. After looking over at his vacant bed, the other three buddies noticed that all of his personal possessions were still at the location where they had been left. All of his belongings, including his bag, his hiking gear, his wallet, and his phone, were arranged in an orderly fashion exactly where he had left them the previous evening. It was the first and most reasonable assumption that he must have gotten up a little bit earlier than usual and sneaked out of the cabin in a stealthy manner. It is possible that he needed to use the outhouse, or it is also possible that he simply desired to go outdoors and take a breath of fresh air. It was their assumption that he had simply been quiet in order to avoid waking them up and that he would return at any moment. As a result, the three buddies began to get ready for the day, disregarding Colin's absence from these preparations. They anticipated that he would return at any moment and go back through the door. Despite the fact that he had gone for a little walk before morning in order to stretch his legs, he was aware of the plan. He had a strict adherence to the plans. Without a doubt, he would return by 7 o'clock, which was the time that they had agreed upon for their departure. However, as the minutes ticked by steadily, a feeling of dread started to make its way into the room. There was a passing of 5:30. Then it is 6 o'clock. Next, it is 6:30. Colin has not been seen or heard from since. It was not a phone call. He had not sent a text message. Just now, he had disappeared. Concerns began to arise among the friends. Colin's behavior was utterly out of character in this regard. It was he who was accountable, the one who was an adept navigator. Without informing anyone of his intended destination, he would not just disappear into the night in the middle of the Siberian wilderness without a known destination. In no way did it make any sense at all. 7 o'clock in the morning, which was the time that they had agreed to leave, Colin was still absent. With the passage of time, the original feeling of worry had developed into a full-blown concern. The region immediately surrounding the cabin was the subject of a speedy search that his friends conducted. They inquired about his name. The outhouse was examined once more by them. As the frost covered the ground, they searched for any footprints that might have been left behind. And still, they discovered nothing. It appeared as though he had simply exited the cabin and vanished from existence. It was as if he had passed away. They were aware that they needed to seek assistance at that point. Simply waiting around was no longer an option for them. A brief message was written by them before they left, and it was affixed to the front door of the cabin for safekeeping. The sender of the message was Colin. The note read something along the lines of, "If you come back and see this, we've gone to get help. We're looking for you. Please stay here or let someone know you're safe." After posting the note, the three friends left the cabin and went straight to the nearest police station in Arshan to let them know that their friend was missing. It was taken quite seriously by the local police department. Unusual was the disappearance of a young and experienced American outdoorsman who had been out in the wilderness. Almost immediately, they started a comprehensive search operation. An enormous search area was conducted, which encompassed the thick forest that surrounded the settlement of Arshan and extended all the way up the slopes of Love Peak itself. There were scores of local volunteers, including some individuals from the group that Colin had worked with in the past, who participated in the massive effort that was undertaken by law enforcement authorities, professional rescue teams, and other volunteers. Every single one of them was really worried since they were aware of how skilled he was. When Colin's family returned to the United States, they were confronted with the phone call that every parent dreads receiving. It was reported to them that their son had gone missing in Siberia. In response, they expressed complete and utter astonishment. A Colin? Is it lost? It appeared to be impossible. It turned out to be the young man who had spent years researching the environment in question. The individual in question was not a careless traveler who strayed off the path. It was almost as if he was an expert in the area. They made frantic efforts to obtain information, but in light of the fact that they were located thousands of miles away, they felt absolutely useless. They had no choice except to wait, hope, and pray for a solution. The search went on, day after day, without stopping. Due to the extreme weather conditions, which included freezing winds and snow on occasion, the search conditions were considered to be challenging and risky. In the Siberian wilderness, the expanse of the forest seemed intimidating. Out there, it is possible for a person to vanish without ever being located. The hope of discovering Colin alive began to dwindle as the days continued to pass, with one day turning into 2, then 3, and finally ending up being a full week. In the end, a breakthrough occurred on Monday, April 4th, which was 8 full days after Colin had vanished from the cabin over the previous week. Around 1 mile distant from the cabin, a group of people were searching through a part of forest while looking for the missing person. It was a heavily populated and challenging location to get through. A little clearing appeared in front of them as they made their way through the dense underbrush and the trees that were blocking their path. And in the midst of that expansive clearing, they caught sight of something. It was, as the search party got closer, that they realized their worst fears were correct. Yes, it was Colin. And it was too late for him. In the middle of the clearing, he was discovered lying on his back in a flat position. An odd, almost posed stance was arranged on his body, and it was quite peculiar. His right arm was also extended, but it was bent slightly and brought closer to his body. His left arm was stretched out straight to his side, and his right arm was also extended. At the same time, he had both of his palms gripped into a firm, tight fist. After conducting a more thorough investigation, the first responders discovered a number of unsettling details. On both of his wrists and on both of his hands, there were wounds and abrasions that were clearly evident. The pattern of these injuries appeared to be what a medical examiner would refer to as restraint marks. It appeared as though someone or something had been holding him down with a great deal of force. On the front of his neck, there were also scrapes and abrasions that were present. His attire, which included a thermal shirt with long sleeves, heavy-duty hiking pants, and his robust hiking boots, was ripped and torn in multiple places, which indicated that he had been involved in a violent conflict. In addition to that, there was a peculiar and insignificant information that would turn out to be of great importance. No socks were on Colin's feet at the time. Inside his hiking boots, which were tightly knotted, he was wearing his bare feet. Despite the fact that this may appear to be a trivial matter, for everyone who knew Colin, it was a significant warning sign. A substantial amount of scar tissue was left behind on Colin's ankles as a result of the procedures that he had previously undergone on both of them. It was something that he had mentioned to his friends and family on numerous occasions that if he did not wear thick socks, the scar tissue would scrape against the inside of his boots, causing him to experience excruciating discomfort. Never in his life did he go trekking without his socks on. He adhered to this norm in his daily life. Nevertheless, the state of the body was the aspect that the medical staff who initially inspected it found to be the most puzzling. It is reasonable to anticipate that a body would exhibit substantial signs of decomposition after being exposed to the environment and the animals for a period of 8 days in the remote regions of Siberia. Colin's body, on the other hand, exhibited hardly none. According to the remarks of one official, all of his wounds, including the cuts and abrasions on his wrists and neck, appeared to be fresh. It appeared as if the struggle and his death had occurred no more than a few moments ago. To put it succinctly, the scene did not give the impression that the person had become disoriented and had given in to the elements. It seemed as though the individual had lately been involved in a serious physical altercation, one that he had been unsuccessful in winning. The scene appeared to be that of a homicide. The Russian authorities proceeded with a stunning speed to shut the case, despite the fact that there was a lot of evidence that was both bizarre and persuasive. Their first hypothesis, which swiftly evolved into their official conclusion, was that all three of Colin's buddies had to have been involved in the crime. However, the friends were brought in for further interrogation, and they all denied having any involvement with Colin's death. Additionally, they all volunteered to take lie detector tests, which they all passed after they were given the opportunity to do so. It appeared as though the Russian authorities had lost interest in any other possible instances of foul play now that their major suspects had been implicated. Rapidly, they came to an agreement on a conclusive and formal answer. As a result, they came to the conclusion that Colin must have been under the influence of drugs, alcohol, or both. During this changed state, they asserted that he must have wandered out of the cabin in a state of disorientation, become disoriented in the woods, and ultimately succumbed to hypothermia. It was determined that the case was closed. He died of a frozen state. The story has come to an end. The answer that was provided to Colin's parents was not only unsatisfactory, but it was also an insult to their son's memory. They were familiar with Colin. He was not a person who acted recklessly. It was not true that he was a drug user. Furthermore, he was an absolute master when it came to getting around in that particular region of Siberia. The concept that he would simply wander off and become so hopelessly lost that he would die of exposure a mile away from his cabin appeared to be totally absurd. The official account did not make sense, and there were an excessive number of questions that remained unresolved. All of the evidence, including the clenched fists, the restraining marks, the missing socks, the wounds that appeared to be new, and the absence of decomposition, did not fit into the straightforward story of a guy who died from freezing to death. Because they were unwilling to accept the official decision, Colin's parents made the decision to take matters into their own hands. They had the knowledge that they required an impartial and objective opinion. Therefore, they decided to use a private forensic laboratory that is situated in the United States and has a stellar reputation. They arranged for all of the material from the Russian autopsy, including the reports, the photographs, and the findings of the toxicological test, to be delivered to this laboratory for a comprehensive examination. Whether the conclusion reached by the Russians was correct, or whether something far more ominous had occurred to their son, they were interested in being informed. The American laboratory started its investigation, and it didn't take them long to discover significant flaws in the official position taken by the Russian government. As a matter of fact, their discoveries entirely disassembled it, each component by component. The toxicological report was the first thing that they looked at. The Russian authorities had proposed the idea that Colin was either under the influence of alcohol or drugs. After doing an analysis of the toxicology data, the laboratory in the United States came to the conclusion that this is unquestionably not true. Colin was not under the effect of alcohol at any point in it. When he was sober, an extremely minute and insignificant quantity of THC, which is the psychoactive component of marijuana, was discovered in his urine. On the other hand, the level was so low that it suggested that he had probably consumed it quite a few days, if not a week, or perhaps more, before to his disappearance. It is quite unlikely that it would have had any kind of psychotropic impact on him on the night that he goes missing. This discovery was in direct and total opposition to the fundamental tenet of the hypothesis that the Russian police had been using. Second, the laboratory investigated the root of the death. The official diagnosis was hypothermia as the cause of death. But the forensic pathologists from the United States arrived at a different conclusion. According to the evidence that was found in the photographs taken during the autopsy, particularly the abrasions that were found on his neck, as well as other internal markers, they came to the conclusion that Colin did not die as a result of being exposed to the cold. All of the signals, on the other hand, pointed to a considerably more violent conclusion. Based on their findings, they concluded that suffocation was the most likely cause of death. He was the victim of a homicide. Until the moment he passed away, his capacity to breathe was severely restricted because someone had either suffocated him or crushed his airway. This brings us to the third and possibly most disturbing point. The laboratory examined the condition of Colin's body when it was discovered. It was corroborated by them that the initial responders had noticed the nearly complete absence of decomposition, the freshness of the injuries, and the fact that his body had not been touched by any animals that were foraging for food, which is quite unusual for a body that has been left in the woods for more than a week. In light of this information, they came to a conclusion that was shocking. It indicated that Colin had not passed away on the night that he could not be found. It indicated that he had been alive for the majority of the 8 days that hundreds of people had been searching for him, if not all of them simultaneously. The evidence strongly suggested that he had died within a very short time, most likely just a few hours before his body was discovered in that area on April 4th. This was the conclusion that was reached by using the evidence. These fresh discoveries from the American laboratory revealed a horrifying and devastating new picture of what must have occurred to Colin Madsen because of his circumstances. The situation was not one in which a hiker became disoriented. This was a case of kidnapping and murdering the victim. Consequently, let us make an effort to reconstruct the events by using this new evidence that is more exact. On March 28, between the hours of 2 and 5 in the morning, Colin awoke. This occurred somewhere in the pre-dawn hours of the day. He climbed out of his bed in a stealthy manner and exited the cabin. Utilizing the outhouse, which was located a short distance away, would be the most reasonable explanation for this behavior. His attire was not appropriate for a hike. Neither of his belongings were taken by him. Even his socks were not put on by him. The intention was for this to be a little excursion, nothing more than a minute or two, and then straight back to bed. As soon as he went out into the chilly and gloomy morning of Siberia, however, he discovered that he was not alone. They were waiting in the shadows, and it was either someone or some individuals. The fact that a violent struggle took place is something that we are aware of, but we do not know whether they ambushed him or whether they enticed him away from the cabin. These are the telltale indicators of a guy who is battling for his life. The shredded clothing, the abrasions on his hands and wrists, and the clenched fists. On the other hand, he was ultimately defeated. He had been kidnapped. Probably the most terrifying aspect of this enigma is what transpired after that with him. He was kidnapped from the environment surrounding the cabin and held captive for close to 8 days in a location unknown. This is where he was abducted. Why was he taken away from us? We are unable to provide responses to these queries. He was being detained against his will for a period of 8 days, during which time his friends, his family, and a large search party were making frantic efforts to locate him. Imagine the suffering that he must have been subjected to during that period of time. After that, his assailant or assailants murdered him on or around April 4th, which was the day that his body was discovered. Suffocation was the result. Following his passing, his body was relocated and positioned in that area in the forest, which was approximately 1 mile away from the cabin. Where is that? Would you say that the locu as the council, whatever that was? She would not have been surprised in the least. The manner in which the letter was printed, folded up to such a small size, and then taped to the back of the computer was something that brought Allison a great deal of astonishment. Simply put, it appeared to be so strange and so covert. When Allison arrived at the police station, she took the note with her and gave it to the officer who was in charge of Ray's case. It was received as evidence by the police, who also informed her that they would be in touch with her regarding the matter. However, they did not communicate with one another. However, despite the passage of several days, Ray did not appear and the authorities did not provide any new information. And as a result, Allison was completely at a loss for what else to do. However, on May 22nd, which is 6 days after Ray vanished, Allison received a phone call from her parents. At the time, she was at home listening to the news. They informed her that they had been searching the city for Ray and that they had discovered something when they were operating their vehicle. A few minutes later, Allison's vehicle slid into a parking lot in the central business district of Baltimore. She parked her vehicle in close proximity to the vehicle that belonged to her parents. The entire region was teeming with law enforcement personnel and people driving news vans. Allison had the ability to see what everyone else was looking at despite the hectic swarm of people that she was surrounded by. This was Ray's vehicle. As a result, Allison stepped out of her vehicle and ran to the nearest police officer, where she inquired about the situation's current state of affairs. After her parents had seen Ray's car, they informed her that they had reached out to the authorities to report the incident. Due to the fact that officers had arrived to conduct an investigation, they saw that Ray's vehicle had a parking ticket displayed on the windshield. It was evident from the ticket that the vow in secret appears to be carried out in a very poor manner. There are other hypotheses that suggest it could have been a crime of opportunity, a robbery that went awry, or a personal quarrel with a nearby resident that we are unaware of. However, none of these hypotheses adequately explain the peculiar and protracted character of the crime, which consisted of the 8-day period of captivity prior to the murder. It was not surprising to see how the Russian authorities would respond to the discoveries that were discovered by the American laboratory. They were entirely disregarded by anyone. They remained steadfast in their judgment that the death was the result of hypothermia brought on by an accident. However, the investigation in Russia has not yet been concluded. This is not a riddle that needs to be solved for them. Those who were close to Colin described the event as a complete nightmare. Not only did they suffer the loss of their good buddy in the most heinous manner, but they also had to go through the agony of being the major suspects in his killing, were searching for Ray throughout the entire city. A volunteer search group made the decision to go up onto the roof of a downtown parking garage on May 24th, which was now 8 days after Ray had been reported missing. This was 2 days after the initial report of her disappearance. In order to assist them in their quest for Ray, they desired to have a more comprehensive perspective of the city. When they reached the top of the mountain, they witnessed something that, if it had anything to do with Ray, was really dark. Because of this, they quickly dialed the police number. A historic structure known as the Belvedere was located just next to this parking garage. It was once a luxurious hotel, but it has since been converted into a condominium complex. At the point where it reached its tallest position, the main part of the Belvedere was 13 floors vertical. But in addition to that, it was connected to a smaller piece that was still a part of the building, and this section was just 2 stories tall. They were able to see the main Belvedere building from the top of the parking garage where the search team was located. However, if they looked down, they could also see the roof of the smaller 2-story section of the structure. And while they were on that roof, they noticed 4 things: a pair of flip-flops, a pair of glasses, a mobile phone, and a hole in the roof that was quite evident. A detective by the name of Michael Bayer and a group of Baltimore police officers were following a concierge down a hallway within the Belvedere building during the span of an hour. When Detective Bayer and his crew had initially arrived, they had spoken with the workers of the building about a hole that was located in the roof of that 2-story part. On the other hand, none of them had any idea what the police were explaining. An explanation was provided by the staff members that the section of the structure that appeared to have the hole was in fact closed off and had been for a considerable amount of time. It would appear that nobody, or at least not any member of the staff, had visited that particular location in the recent past. As a result, they were unable to determine whether or not there was a hole in that area. Nobody knew for sure, but there was a possibility. To add insult to injury, not a single member of the staff or resident had reported seeing or hearing anything out of the ordinary in the past week and a half. As a result, there was no evidence to suggest that any injury had been sustained anywhere within the structure. However, at this point, the concierge was directing Detective Bayer and his team around a number of meandering hallways and through a number of locked doors until they eventually arrived at the room that corresponded to the location of the hole in the roof. Additionally, as soon as the door to that room was unlocked by the concierge, Detective Bayer and his crew were confronted with a foul odor. Once inside, they went. One could tell that it had been a conference room in the past because it was a very large room that was completely empty. Ray Rivera's body was illuminated by the light that was coming down from the hole in the ceiling. The light was shining right on her. Around Ray, who was laying on the floor with her face up, dried blood was all around her. He had a mutilated body there. Because of the severity of the break, the bones of one of his legs were protruding at strange angles. In addition to this, he had fallen into a state of extreme decomposition, which was definitely the cause of the foul odor. Initially, Detective Bayer was examining the body of Ray. He then turned his attention to the hole in the roof, and he said to himself, okay, it is obvious that Ray fell through the roof and landed here. Using that method, he was able to enter this locked room. The roof was broken by his entrance. However, after conducting a more thorough examination of the hole, as well as the items that the search party had observed on the roof, such as the glasses, the flip-flops, and the cell phone, and then later on, when they performed an autopsy on Ray's body, they came to the conclusion that it was physically impossible for Ray to have entered this room through the hole. This is due to the fact that there were only 3 conceivable locations on the roof of the Belvedere from which Ray might have dropped or jumped in order to arrive at that particular location with her landing. In addition, when you compared them to the evidence that the police had, none of them made any sense at all. There was a potential that Ray had either fallen or jumped from the very top of the main Belvedere building, which is 13 floors tall. This was the initial scenario. His shattered legs, broken skull, and broken ribs were among the catastrophic injuries that were discovered during the autopsy. It is certain that he would have died as a result of a fall from that height, which would have also caused the injuries that were discovered. The hole in the roof of the second story was located 45 feet away from the edge of the roof of the 13th story, which was located from the horizontal. From a physics perspective, it was practically impossible that Ray could have somehow gotten a running start, leaped off the roof as hard as he could, and carried himself 45 feet forward before plunging down and hitting the roof. A person would not be able to jump that far, because it is simply too far away. The second hypothesis was that Ray had possibly fallen out of a decorative ledge that could be found on the 11th level of the Belvedere. This ledge was thin and looped around the exterior of the building. It is possible that Ray would have landed in the location where the hole was if he had fallen from that height. On the other hand, it was not possible to reach that ledge without first passing through a condo or office that was privately owned and located on that floor. In order for Ray to enter one of those secret areas, she would have needed to be physically allowed to do so. On the other hand, no one in any part of the building had reported seeing him or having any kind of confrontation with him. There was also the possibility that Ray had jumped off the top of the parking garage where the search team had been present. This was the third scenario. The distance between them was close enough horizontally that if he had jumped, he would have been able to land in the same location as the hole. However, the very highest point of that parking garage was just around 20 feet over the roof of the Belvedere, which was located on the second floor. Even if a fall of 20 feet is definitely high enough to do substantial harm to your body, it is not a fall that is high enough to cause the severe injuries that were discovered on Ray's body. It was simply not a drop that was long enough. And then, to make this whole situation even stranger, when the police examined those items that were found on the roof next to the hole, they discovered that all of the items were not scattered around, as if he had blasted through the roof and everything had just flown off of him. This was the case with Ray's flip-flops, his glasses, and his cell phone. On the contrary, they appeared to be arranged in a manner that was somewhat planned, and were arranged in a nice manner on the roof, almost as if they had been set there on purpose. Additionally, neither Ray's spectacles nor his phone were in any way harmed in the incident. Therefore, it was only natural to wonder how something like this could have taken place. Simply put, what caused him to collapse in the first place? And even if you were able to determine the source of his fall, you would still be unable to explain how his personal items were able to be arranged so neatly on the roof without being damaged in any way. It simply did not make any sense at all. And as a result, the authorities were at a loss for what to make of all of this. Consequently, they refocused their attention on a completely new piece of evidence, which was the peculiar note that Allison had discovered affixed to the back of Ray's computer in their residence. In the hope that it would provide them with some information, they forwarded that memo to the FBI for examination. It did, in fact. When the FBI returned, they stated that based on the message, it was highly likely that Ray was suffering from mental illness and was going through some kind of psychotic episode at the time that he wrote it. Their statement was that this was not a screenplay. The fact that he was experiencing this was evidence that something was severely wrong in his head. It was a bit of a comfort for the police, even though this did not completely explain all of the questions that they had. It appeared to provide a general explanation of a scenario that was extremely convoluted and hard to understand. In essence, this was sufficient for the Baltimore Police Department to cease their investigation, despite the fact that they did not officially conclude the case. And they informed Ray's wife Allison and her family that Ray's death, as strange as it was, and even though they didn't really know how it happened, they did know that it was most likely a suicide. They also reported that they knew that Ray had committed himself. Allison, on the other hand, was not at all content with this specific answer. To begin, it did not provide an explanation to the fundamental question of where Ray had fallen from. That appeared to be a situation that needed to be resolved as soon as possible. Irrespective of the fact that she was totally certain that Ray had not committed suicide, she did not believe that he suffered from any form of mental illness. In Allison's perspective, her husband was murdered, and it was quite likely that his job was the reason for his death. In this very moment, he was acting as if he were some kind of investment genius, and he was sending out these tips into that email that she and he both knew were, in essence, fake. The subject of investing was completely foreign to him. There was a possibility that the subscribers might be taken advantage of in a significant way. Many people were following his recommendations, and as a result, they might be losing a significant amount of money. Consequently, it appeared to her that it was not out of the question that someone who was upset with him for the poor advice he had given had gone after him. Furthermore, in addition to the notion that this was not an act of self-harm, there was that peculiar phone call, which added to the notion that something negative had occurred to Ray from an external source. When he shouted, "Oh shit," and then raced out of the home, Claudia, their acquaintance, had overheard him speak on the phone. Claudia had overheard him take the call. Specifically, the police were able to track down the call in question. Stansbury and Associates, the investment business to which Ray was employed, was the source of the information. No matter how hard they tried, they were never able to determine who had phoned him or why they had called him in the first place. As soon as the investigators started asking questions at the company, Stansbury and Associates engaged attorneys and instructed all of its employees to keep quiet about what had occurred, not even to the police. This was done because the company wanted to protect its reputation. This is the reason why the case of Ray Rivera has not been formally solved until this day. On the other hand, the individual who made that last phone call to Ray is still missing somewhere in the world. When Ray hurried out of his house in a panic that night, this individual must know the reason why he did so. And they might even know who was responsible for his death or how he passed away. However, as of this moment, that individual has not stepped forward. You are very much appreciated for watching. If you watched today's program, please share your thoughts with me in the comments section. You should also keep in mind that we have a whole playlist of episodes of true crime ready for you to watch in one sitting right now. Up until the next time. What's up? On the evening of the 3rd of June, 2004, a 23-year-old college junior named Jesse Valencia walked into a restaurant in Columbia, Missouri, carrying far more stress than he let show on his face. Just days earlier, Jesse had stood in a courtroom expecting a minor charge from a college house party to quietly disappear. Instead, prosecutors escalated the case, leaving him suddenly facing a much more serious offense. But if you had looked at Jesse that night, you never would have guessed any of that. The moment he spotted his friends waving from a table in the back of the restaurant, his expression shifted into the same easy smile everyone knew him for. Jesse was the kind of person who seemed impossible to intimidate. He was studying journalism and pre-law at the University of Missouri, juggling classes, work, parties, and an enormous social circle all at once. Friends described him as magnetic, outgoing, fearless, and always searching for excitement. Even after the stressful court hearing, Jesse refused to let it ruin the beginning of his summer break. School was finally out, and for the first time in months, he wanted to forget about deadlines, legal trouble, and uncertainty about the future. He just wanted one carefree night with friends. But beneath that confident exterior, Jesse's life had quietly become much more complicated than most people around him realized. The court case was only one problem among many. His recent breakup had left him emotionally spiraling, his finances were falling apart, and over the past few weeks, he had started spending time with someone he absolutely should not have been involved with. It was the kind of secret that could destroy careers, relationships, and lives if it ever became public. And before the weekend was over, that secret would leave Jesse Valencia dead on a patch of grass just blocks away from campus. And so, as soon as he sat down at the table with his friends, one of them immediately asked him about it. They said, "Hey, how did that court hearing go the other day?" And Jesse just shook his head and said it didn't go too well. He told them he thought the whole thing was kind of ridiculous. He really had hoped the charge would have been dropped by now. But when he had gone into the courtroom, he found out the charge had actually been upgraded, not downgraded. The prosecutor had changed it to obstructing a government operation by physical interference, which was a more serious offense. But Jesse told his friends he still wasn't that worried about it. He said he had pleaded not guilty, and his plan was to fight this thing all the way to the end, even if it took the entire summer. The thing was, this charge, this court case, was actually the least of Jesse's problems at that moment. He had much bigger, much heavier things weighing on his mind that summer. His longtime boyfriend, a man named Jack Barry, had broken up with him recently. And Jesse was having a very, very hard time coping with it. It was one of those breakups where one person is completely done and the other person is still holding on. Jack had said he wanted to stay friends, but the reality was, even though the intention behind it was probably good, it just made everything harder for Jesse. Because they were trying to be friends, it meant that Jesse and Jack were still spending a fair amount of time together. They were still talking and socializing in the same circles. And while Jack felt like things were definitively over romantically, Jesse didn't feel that way at all. For him, it just sort of felt like they were perpetually on the verge of getting back together, even when all the signs pointed to that not being true. And then, whenever Jesse would try to talk to Jack about maybe making things work again, trying to give the relationship another shot, Jack would immediately and gently but firmly turn him down. The whole situation was just a constant cycle of hope and rejection, and it was really taking a toll on him. So, without Jack in his life as a partner anymore, Jesse had become incredibly lonely. He had been trying to fill that void with random hookups. He was meeting guys online and sometimes inviting them back to the hotel where he worked as a night clerk. But for the most part, it was all very shallow. It didn't mean anything to him, and it wasn't what he was looking for. For a little while, Jesse had been having this secret affair with an older man, which had been exciting in a forbidden kind of way. But deep down, what Jesse really wanted was a real, committed relationship, something like what he thought he had had with Jack. And these random, fleeting encounters were just not cutting it. And so, at this point in his life, basically every time Jesse went out socially, no matter what he was doing or who he was with, he was always kind of on the hunt. He was always scanning the room, looking for somebody who could potentially have long-term relationship potential. And this night, this dinner with his friends, was no exception. That night, Jesse and his friends had a nice long dinner together. They talked and laughed, and when they were all done, they left the restaurant and walked a few blocks down the street to a popular gay dance club called the Sioux Club. Inside, the place was dark, the air was thick with energy, and the music was loud and thumping. As soon as they walked inside, Jesse immediately weaved his way through the crowd on the dance floor and made a beeline straight for the DJ booth. He leaned over and asked the DJ to play his favorite song, which was Billie Jean by Michael Jackson. The DJ just sort of rolled their eyes and gave a little sigh. Jesse knew the DJ was probably annoyed with him. He was a regular here, and he requested that exact same song every single time he came to this club. But Jesse had never let other people's opinions stop him from doing what he wanted. He didn't care if the DJ was annoyed. He just wanted to hear his song. After he had made his request, Jesse went over to the bar and ordered a drink. And while he was waiting for the bartender, he saw a young man standing all by himself at the other end of the bar. Once the bartender passed Jesse his drink, Jesse took a sip and then walked over to the man. He smiled and asked him if he wanted to dance. The man smiled back and said, "Sure." And so one dance turned into two, and then two turned into three. And pretty soon, the two of them had spent the whole night on the dance floor together. It was hard to hear each other over the loud music, but over the course of several dances and shouting into each other's ears, Jesse had learned that this man's name was Ed McDevitt, and he was in town training to be a chef. Jesse felt like Ed was a really nice, cool guy, and it seemed like they had an immediate and genuine connection. And so, when the club finally closed for the night, Jesse asked Ed if he wanted to come home with him. Ed said yes. After that, Jesse found his friend Jennifer and asked if she wouldn't mind giving them a ride back to his apartment. She said, of course. And so, shortly after that, the trio left the club. They got into Jennifer's car, and she drove them back to Jesse's apartment building. When Jesse and Ed got out of the car, Jennifer leaned over from the driver's seat and said, "Hey, tomorrow night I'm having a party at my place. You two should come by." And Jesse, he turned to Ed and kind of winked at him and said, "Yeah, hopefully we'll both be there." And then Jennifer smiled and drove off into the night. After Jennifer was gone, Jesse walked Ed down the short flight of stairs to his very run-down basement apartment. And as soon as they went inside, Ed was confronted with this sea of books. There were stacks of history books all over the living room, on shelves, on the floor, on the coffee table. It turned out Jesse was really into ancient Greek history. And so Ed began walking around, picking them up, opening these old worn history books. And as Ed did that, Jesse began to regale him with tales of the Battle of Thermopylae, explaining how the small force of Spartans were so dramatically outnumbered, but how they held their ground. He talked about Zeus and the other ancient Greek gods, and he was just kind of going off on all the stuff that Jesse really loved and was passionate about. And Ed, as he listened to him, just said, "I really don't know much about history, but it's really fascinating that you're so into it." From there, the rest of the night went great for the two of them. They would end up spending the night together. And then, at about 10 o'clock the next morning, as Ed was getting ready to leave, they made plans to meet up again at Jennifer's party that night. Before Ed left, he wrote his phone number down on a scrap piece of paper and he gave it to Jesse. And Jesse took the paper, and then he walked Ed to the door and gave him a hug and a kiss before he left. And then, once Ed was gone, Jesse closed the door and just leaned against it, hoping that maybe, just maybe, this wasn't going to be just another meaningless hookup. Maybe this had the potential to be the start of a strong, long-term relationship, the one thing Jesse really, truly wanted. Around noon that day, Jesse was in his kitchen eating a quick lunch before he had to head out for work when he heard a sharp knock on his door. He walked over and opened it up, and he saw his landlord standing in the hallway. And his landlord looked pretty mad. He told Jesse that, "Hey, it's the 4th of the month, and you still haven't paid this month's rent." Jesse apologized profusely and just said, it totally slipped his mind. And he promised he would get the money to the landlord that afternoon. But after the landlord accepted his answer and left, and Jesse shut the door, he couldn't help but have this sort of sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. Because the truth was, he didn't have the money for rent. Jesse had grown up in a very poor family in a small town in Kentucky. He was actually the first person in his entire family to go to college. And he was paying his own bills by working as a hotel clerk, the same job his mother had had back home. Now, Jesse loved his family, and he spoke to them on the phone basically every single day. He would call them all the time. But at the same time, he had always felt so trapped in his conservative, ultra-religious hometown. So he had left, and he had tried to sort of reinvent himself as someone new, the kind of person who could do anything and go anywhere. But even though he had done that, it would turn out that making real money was something that he just hadn't quite figured out how to do yet. Before Jesse left for work that afternoon, he scrounged up all the cash he could find in his apartment, but it still wasn't enough to make the full rent payment. He dropped the cash he did have in the landlord's mailbox anyway, along with a little note promising that he would get the rest of it together in a couple of weeks. Then he walked to his job at the campus inn and spent a pretty uneventful evening behind the front desk, just counting down the hours until the end of his shift. And as soon as the clock struck 11 p.m., he bolted out of the hotel and hurried home. He immediately changed his clothes and then headed right back out to Jennifer's party, where he was supposed to meet his new love interest, Ed McDevitt. However, when Jesse walked into that party, he scanned the crowd, but he didn't see Ed. He did a full lap around the apartment, checking every room, but he wasn't there. And so Jesse just grabbed a beer out of the fridge and started chatting with Jennifer while he waited, hoping Ed was just running late. But after a while, he checked his watch and realized that either Ed was running really, really late or he just wasn't coming at all. So trying to tell himself that it wasn't quite time to be disappointed yet, maybe there was a simple explanation for this, Jesse went outside to the porch and he called the phone number that Ed had written down on that piece of paper that morning. Now, this phone number was for a landline phone. And so, Jesse, he punched it in and he listened. It rang for a few beats, and then somebody picked up. It was a guy's voice, but it was not Ed. It was somebody whose name was Mark Butler. And, Jesse had never heard of this guy. And he asked, where's Ed? And Mark explained that he was Ed's roommate. And that actually, Ed was asleep right now. He had to work early in the morning, and so he had decided not to go to Jennifer's party. He just wanted to get some sleep. Now, as Mark was telling him this, Jesse was trying to make sense of the situation. Like, okay, is Mark Ed's boyfriend or something? Are they together? Or are they really just roommates? And also, Jesse couldn't help but feel like Mark clearly did not want to be talking to him right now. It was pretty obvious from his tone that he was trying to just get off the phone as quickly as possible. But Jesse was not ready to just give up. He really wanted to see Ed. And so he told Mark, well, hold on a minute. Can you please just go wake him up? I really need to talk to him. And at first, Mark was like, no, he's asleep. He has to work in the morning. Like, he does not want me waking him up. But Jesse was relentless. He just kept pushing, begging Mark to please, just for a second, put Ed on the phone. And eventually, after what felt like a long time, Mark relented with a heavy sigh. About a minute later, a very groggy-sounding Ed hopped on the phone. And as soon as Jesse heard his voice, he was so excited. He basically launched into this big pitch, telling Ed all the reasons why he should not go to bed and why he should come out to this party, and that he really, really wanted to see him again. And also, he added, hey, bring your friend Mark too. That was fine with him. Now, it's not really clear if Ed was all that excited about this idea, but he would eventually say, fine, I'll come out and meet you, and I will bring Mark. When they got there, Mark would only stay at Jennifer's party for a little while before he headed out on his own. But Ed and Jesse, they would stick around until about 2 a.m., and then, at that point, they would leave Jennifer's house and go to another party that was happening right across the street. At around 3 a.m., though, Ed said he really did have to get going. It was so late, and he had to get up for work in the morning. Like, he really had to go this time. And so, at this point, Jesse understood that this was reasonable. And so he walked him out to the sidewalk, and then he asked him, hey, do you want to come over to my place? But Ed said, no, really. I have to get home. I have to go to bed. However, before Ed did finally leave, the two of them would make plans to see each other again in just a couple of days. After Ed had taken off, Jesse wandered back across the street to say goodbye to Jennifer. And then, after that, he began making the short walk back to his own apartment. And as he was walking through the quiet, dark streets, he began to think that he really didn't want to go home alone. If Ed didn't want to come over, well, he was going to find somebody else who would. And so his first thought was to call his ex, Jack. So Jesse pulled out his phone and called Jack a few times. And when Jack did not pick up, which after all, it's 3 o'clock in the morning and they are no longer in a relationship, it's sort of reasonable that he wouldn't answer, but Jesse still wanted to see him. And so he walked a few blocks out of his way to make an actual stop at Jack's apartment building. Jesse went right up to the front door and he banged on it, but nobody came to the door. Jack didn't answer. At this point, standing on Jack's dark doorstep, Jesse began to wonder if maybe Jack was out with somebody else right now. And he suddenly felt this sharp pang of jealousy. Or worse, maybe Jack was in there, and he knew that Jesse was outside, but he just didn't want to see him and was intentionally ignoring him. After a couple of minutes of standing there and knocking a few more times and still not hearing anything from inside, Jesse finally gave up. He stumbled back towards his own apartment, drunk and lonely and feeling a bit heartbroken. Jesse finally stepped foot inside his apartment and shut the door behind him at about 3:45 a.m. However, right after he had gotten undressed and flopped down onto his bed, he heard a knock at his front door. At 2 p.m. the following day, which was Saturday, the 5th of June, 2004, a college student walked out of an apartment just down the street from Jesse's building. He was carrying a backpack and a cooler. His friends had just pulled up in the parking lot, and they were all about to head out for a weekend trip to St. Louis. But while he was loading his stuff into the trunk of the car, he noticed somebody lying in the grass nearby, wearing nothing but a pair of running shorts. Now, at first, he just assumed, this was probably just somebody who had passed out drunk from a crazy Friday night party, which sort of happened all the time in a college town like Columbia. But when he took a few steps closer just to be sure this person was okay, he saw flies buzzing around their body. About 30 minutes later, Columbia Police Detective John Short felt his pager go off. He unclipped it from his belt loop, and he saw there was a message from his boss's phone number that just read 911. Detective Short called his boss right away, and he was given the address for a crime scene just off the University of Missouri campus. Short drove there, parked his car on the curb, and then he walked over to the yellow tape that was keeping a growing crowd of worried neighbors away from the scene. Another detective, Tim Geiger, waved to Short and led him over to the patch of grass where the victim was lying. There was a young man, sprawled out on his back, and he was wearing a pair of light blue running shorts. He had no shoes, no socks, and no shirt. And stretched across his throat was this very deep, very clean gash. The medical examiner was already there, and she was crouched down next to the body. She looked up at Detective Short and told him that a few things were already standing out to her. She pointed to the bruises that were all over the victim's face, on their arms, and across their torso. But then, when she carefully lifted the victim's hands, she showed Short that there were no defensive wounds on them at all. She told him that that was pretty unusual for a knife attack. Usually, victims would get their hands up, trying to defend themselves, and as a result, they would get their hands and arms cut up in the process. She also pointed out that the blood had run down both sides of the victim's neck and had pooled in the grass under his body, but there was no blood at all on the front of his body. This meant he was probably already lying down right there in the grass when his throat actually got cut. Finally, the medical examiner gently pulled back the victim's eyelids and showed Detective Short the tiny hemorrhages in his eyes, which they both knew was typically a sign of strangulation. And so, putting all these pieces together, Short theorized that, the victim's killer had likely choked him out first, rendering him unconscious, and then had laid him out on the grass. And then, they had slit his throat while he was laying there, helpless and unable to defend himself. The detective looked down at his victim's bare feet and noticed they were covered in dirt and grass stains like he had been running at some point outside. Short doubted that the encounter between his victim and the killer began right there on the lawn where the body was found. And now he just wondered if maybe there had been some sort of a chase here and that this patch of grass was just where the killer had finally caught up to the victim. But since there was no ID on the victim, Short had no idea who he was or where he might have been running from. And so, Short stood up and stepped away from the body so the crime scene techs could carefully load it into a body bag. Just then, another squad car pulled up, and 2 more officers got out. It was Sergeant Kenneth Smith and Officer Stephen Rios. Rios was the beat cop who typically patrolled this specific neighborhood, So another sergeant who was already on the scene had radioed for him to come over and see if maybe he could help identify the victim. And so at this point, Short told the crime scene techs to go ahead and unzip the body bag and let Officer Rios take a look. Rios came over and he leaned down and he looked inside. And after just a second, he nodded and said that he did recognize this young man. He said it was a college kid that he had actually arrested at a house party just a couple of months ago. He said his name was Jesse Valencia. And so, less than an hour into his investigation, Detective Short now had a name for his victim and some pretty good initial theories about how his victim was killed. His next task, and it was a big one, was figuring out who in the world might have wanted Jesse Valencia dead. So Short immediately looked up Jesse's address and he found that his apartment building was only a single block away from the crime scene. So he walked over there. And while the forensics team went inside the apartment to look for evidence, another officer was posted outside the building to make sure no one came or went until the crime scene was officially cleared and processed. Short walked into the building and headed down the stairs to Jesse's basement unit. And there, the crime scene tech who was dusting the doorway for prints told him that when they had first arrived, the door to the apartment was actually already open. So Short went inside the unit and he began looking around. There was no blood anywhere, and nothing was broken or overturned. So there was no clear sign of a struggle inside the apartment itself, but the door being left wide open suggested that Jesse must have left in a real hurry. And this certainly matched Short's theory about the fight between Jesse and this killer, starting in one location and then ending out on that lawn. Short figured that, Jesse must have run out of his apartment in a panic and made it a block away to that patch of grass before his killer finally overtook him. And so as Short began to consider this, he also started to think, okay, well, Jesse, who appeared to be in reasonably good shape for his age, if he was chased down and tackled and killed only a block away from his apartment, it sort of suggested that his killer was likely pretty strong and pretty fast. So he was probably looking for somebody who was in relatively good physical shape. That's the killer. At least that's the profile he was starting to develop in his mind. And also, the way that Jesse was actually killed, having his throat cut open so violently, it just seemed incredibly personal. Which suggested that whoever killed Jesse was likely somebody that Jesse actually knew. And so, with that in mind, Short finished a sweep of Jesse's apartment, and then he asked a crime scene tech to prioritize getting access to the cell phone and the computer that he saw sitting on Jesse's desk. Then he walked out of the apartment and across the hall to the door of Jesse's closest neighbor, and he knocked. A moment later, a very confused-looking young man poked his head out and asked Short what was going on. Short told him that he was investigating a murder, and he wanted to ask him a few questions. The young man at first just seemed totally shocked and appalled to be hearing this. But then, it was like this look of dawning realization washed over his face. He told Short that the previous night he had actually been woken up by the sound of what was very clearly two grown men fighting in Jesse's apartment. And one of those men was definitely Jesse, because this neighbor heard Jesse clearly saying over and over again, "No," and "Stop it," to this other man. Now, the neighbor kind of sheepishly admitted that, he didn't actually do anything about this at the time. He actually just kind of banged on his own wall and yelled, "Hey, stop it over there." And then shortly after that, the noise had stopped and the neighbor had kind of forgotten all about it and had gone back to sleep, not realizing that what he was likely hearing was the beginning of Jesse's murder. The neighbor told Short that when he had woken up that afternoon, he had actually gone across the hall to apologize to Jesse for being so rude the night before by yelling through the wall. But the neighbor said he found Jesse's door was wide open. And he didn't look inside, he felt like that was kind of rude. But what he thought was, okay, maybe Jesse was so drunk the night before, that was part of the reason that he must have been having this fight. And so perhaps he was so drunk, he just forgot to close the door on his way out or on his way to bed. The neighbor said he did try knocking on the open door a couple of times, but Jesse never came to the door. And so the neighbor just kind of left it at that and went about his business. And so after hearing this, Detective Short asked this neighbor if he had any idea who the other man was that Jesse was fighting with. But the neighbor said he didn't. Jesse, for the most part, kept to himself, and really, the neighbor didn't know Jesse well at all. So, he had no idea who this other person could have been. After that, Short thanked the neighbor for the information. Then, he turned around and headed back inside of Jesse's apartment. And so, at this point, Short was convinced that, based on the neighbor's testimony, that whatever fight led to Jesse's death likely did begin inside Jesse's apartment. And so now Short just had to figure out who were the people that could have potentially been inside of Jesse's apartment so late at night like that. Was this somebody who was a friend, a love interest? Was Jesse trying to kick them out and it sparked a fight? He didn't know. But who were the people in Jesse's life that could have been there late at night? That's what he had to figure out. And luckily, at that very moment, one of the crime scene techs had Jesse's cell phone, and he was holding it up in the air like he had found something important. Now, they wouldn't be able to do a full phone dump until they got it back to the station, and they hadn't even touched the laptop yet. But they had gotten access to Jesse's call logs. And the tech told Short that there was something in there that he would definitely want to see. Because the last time Jesse used his cell phone, according to this log, it was to call somebody named Jack Barry. 7 times. Between 3 a.m. and 3:18 a.m. that morning. So, right away, Detective Short looked up Jack Barry's information, and he found his apartment's address and saw it was not far from Jesse's. And so, he drove right over there. Short knocked on the door, and just a moment later, a young man answered. He had very red, puffy eyes, like he had clearly been crying for a while. Even though Jesse's body had only been discovered a few hours ago, this young man did not seem surprised at all to see a detective at his door. He told the detective that he had already heard the terrible news. A friend had called and told him. After exchanging niceties and the young man confirming that he was in fact Jack, Short followed Jack into his living room. And as they sat down, Short asked Jack about all those 3 a.m. phone calls from Jesse. Jack looked like he was really struggling to hold it together as he told the detective that Jesse was his ex-boyfriend. And Jesse had been kept badgering him, Jack, for them to get back together, and Jack didn't want to. And so those phone calls were very likely a product of more badgering from Jesse. Jack said the night before he had been woken up by his phone ringing over and over and over again. And before he could even look at the caller ID, he heard a knock at his front door. He saw that it was the middle of the night. And then he leaned over and he saw the caller was Jesse. And he sort of figured that, okay, he's calling me. It's very likely him at the front door. I don't want to see him right now. And so Jack just decided he would ignore Jesse and hope that he would eventually go away. Now, when Jack said this, it seemed very clear he was sort of reliving that moment in his mind. Maybe if he had let Jesse in or engaged with him in some way, maybe Jesse would still be alive. That was sort of the insinuation. But Detective Short was thinking, okay, well, even though he seems like he's being very earnest in telling me this, it does mean that he doesn't really have an alibi. He's basically saying that at the time Jesse was killed, he was home alone by himself, which was a pretty weak alibi. However, before Short could begin to poke holes in it, Jack said that, despite the fact that they had broken up, that he and Jesse were, at least in his mind, still on good terms. In fact, they had spoken just the day before on the phone, before getting all those nighttime phone calls. It was during the afternoon. And during that phone call, Jesse had told him all about a new guy he'd met at a club the night before. And his name was Ed McDevitt. That night, Detective Short stood outside of an interrogation room at the police station, watching Ed McDevitt through the two-way glass. Short knew his investigation was moving basically at lightning speed here. But there was still quite a bit of pressure on him to get this case solved even faster. Because Columbia was a college town, a place where kids were used to feeling safe, and the murder of a student just a few blocks off campus had sort of shattered that sense of trust. And so, students and parents and the staff of the university, they really wanted Short to get this thing done quickly. And now, looking at Ed through the glass, Short wondered if maybe this was the killer. Maybe this was the guy. I mean, after all, Ed was visibly shaking and fidgety looking. I mean, he seemed sort of like an emotional wreck, which could mean, of course, that he was just upset because he was connected to the murder victim. That's a traumatic thing to go through. Or it could mean he was hiding something, and now he was about to be interrogated by the police, something that would certainly cause a big emotional reaction. Eventually, Short went inside and sat down across the table, and he asked Ed to explain exactly what he had done the night before. And Ed, in a very nervous, shaky voice, told the detective that he and his roommate, a guy named Mark Butler, had met Jesse at a party a little after 11 p.m. He said he ultimately went back home again around 3 a.m., leaving Jesse on the sidewalk, still very much alive and well. Ed said his roommate Mark had actually seen him return to their apartment at 3 a.m. And Ed said when he went inside, he went straight to bed, and then he had gotten up early for work. Ed said he was at work when he got the call from police telling him that Jesse had been found dead. Detective Short listened to Ed's story, and he asked a few follow-up questions. And then he also took a DNA sample from Ed. And then after that, he told Ed that he was also going to get a warrant to search Ed's home. Ed was already such a wreck that, when Short told him about this search of his home, Ed didn't even really react. However, when Short left the interview room, despite feeling pretty confident that Ed could absolutely be a suspect, he also went and, followed procedure, and he looked up Ed's roommate, Mark Butler. And he discovered in the police department system that there was a Mark Butler, and sure enough, he had a criminal record. So, overnight, while a forensics team was searching Ed and Mark's home, Short actually brought Mark down to the station for an interview. But in reality, Short wasn't expecting Mark to become this primary suspect here. He just wanted to be thorough and rule out anybody who had seen Jesse that night. And obviously, Mark was one of those people. But almost immediately in their interview, Mark started saying some very odd things. He told Short right out of the gate that he did not like Jesse. And actually, he said point blank that he didn't really care that Jesse was dead. But he also clarified to Detective Short that, he was just Ed's roommate. He was not seeing him romantically, so this had nothing to do with jealousy. He just did not like Jesse as a person. Mark confirmed that he did see Ed when he returned from the party around 3 a.m., just like Ed had said. But Mark had actually not stuck around. He said that after Ed had come back to the apartment, Mark had left to go on a date of his own. And he actually didn't know what time he got back home. And so as he was saying this, Short realized that that meant Mark was out and about, sort of unaccounted for, at the same time that Jesse was killed. And so, obviously, something seemed off about Mark. And so Short took a DNA sample from him and added Mark to the growing suspect list. The next morning, Sunday, June 6th, after catching a few hours of sleep, Detective Short gathered his team for a meeting. The mood in the room was tense. Everybody was exhausted and very much on edge from spending nearly 24 hours straight working on this case. But when they went around the room and talked about the flood of leads they had all followed up on yesterday, it didn't actually seem like they had much to show for it. There were now several suspects in play, but none of them seemed to have a good, solid reason to want to kill Jesse Valencia. Jesse had apparently been pestering his ex-boyfriend Jack about trying to get back together, which Jack did not want. And the multiple late-night phone calls and the knocking on the door unannounced, it just seemed like harassment. So, it was possible that maybe Jack had gone over to confront Jesse and things had gotten out of hand. But Jack had told Detective Short that he and Jesse had remained friends after the breakup. And some of the other detectives said that Jesse's friends had said the same thing. The two had remained friends. So, it seemed pretty unlikely that things between them would have escalated so much that somebody got killed. Then there was Ed McDevitt, Jesse's new lover, who had seemed pretty nervous during his interrogation. One of the detectives told Short that while they were searching Ed's house, they had found a bag full of chef's knives, and some of them were large and sharp enough that they could easily have been the murder weapon. But Ed worked in a restaurant and was training to be a chef, so owning a set of kitchen knives was hardly a smoking gun. And then, as for Ed's roommate, Mark Butler, he did have a criminal past, and he openly said he did not like Jesse and didn't care that he had died. But they had only met one time, and it was very likely they would never have seen each other again. So it seemed very unlikely that he would go through the trouble of following Jesse home and killing him. Like, to what end? And so Detective Short was getting really frustrated. He just couldn't make sense of any of these suspects. It was like a key piece of the puzzle was missing here. And so he turned to two of his detectives, Jeff Westbrook and Barbara Cook, and told them to go to some of the local bars that Jesse frequented and just sort of ask around about Jesse, in case there were other leads or other people in his life that they had not uncovered yet. However, right after Detective Short walked out of that meeting that morning, another detective ran up to him and pulled him into a quiet corner. He told him a tip had just come in, and it was so sensitive that they were going to have to keep it under wraps, even amongst the other investigators on the case. The detective told Short that a friend of Jesse's who lived in St. Louis, Louis had called the tip in through Crime Stoppers. He said that he and Jesse chatted online all the time, and that Jesse at one point had told him about a secret affair he was having with an older man. And this older man was actually an officer in the Columbia Police Department. Later that day, so this is Sunday, the 6th of June, 2004, 2 days after Jesse was killed, Detective Short sat at his desk, flipping through printouts of all these online chat logs. And these logs showed conversations between Jesse and the friend of his who had called in the tip that Jesse was having this affair with an officer from Short's own police department. In the chats, Jesse wrote all about this relationship. Jesse had seemed to find it pretty exciting at first, having this police officer come by in uniform and carrying on these secret meetups in the middle of the night. But recently, Jesse had begun to suspect that this police officer was married, and this had made Jesse furious. He had told this friend in the chat log that he wasn't going to be someone's other woman. However, to Short's immense frustration, Jesse never actually named the officer that he was having this affair with. He only ever referred to him as Columbia's finest. And so, whoever this mystery cop was, Detective Short thought they were now the most likely suspect. Because unlike Jesse's other lovers, this officer had something very significant to lose if this relationship went south. If Jesse told anybody about this affair, well, the police officer's career could be on the line because they were clearly carrying on this totally illicit affair while they were on duty. That's not okay. And also, they were using their position and power potentially to actually land this relationship. And then on top of that, the police officer's marriage would likely be destroyed. But Short also knew that he had to move very, very carefully here. Because now he was investigating his own department, which meant that the killer could literally be in the room with him at any time. And so, as he walked through the office to refill his coffee, Short found himself scanning the face of every single officer he passed. And he realized there wasn't a single person here that he could actually trust. Short brought all the files on Jesse's case into his office, and then he told his secretary to find him a complete roster of the department's entire staff. Then he locked the door, sat down at his desk, and he pulled out the records on Jesse's friends who had been interviewed already. And he went down the list himself, calling each and every one of them to dig for more information about this supposed officer. Quite a few of them said that Jesse had in fact told them about this cop he was sleeping with, and one of them remembered Jesse referring to this officer as just Anderson. And so, when Short's secretary came back with the staff roster, Short began looking through it. And he discovered that out of the 200-plus officers in the entire department, there were only 2 officers that had the last name, Anderson, Brad Anderson, and Ted Anderson. And so the next logical step was trying to figure out if either one of them had a connection to Jesse Valencia. And so, Short pulled out the records from Jesse's arrest at that house party back in April. And as he flipped through the report, he realized that Brad Anderson was one of the 3 officers who had responded to that party. The pieces fit together perfectly. Jesse and Brad Anderson, the police officer, would have met around the same time that Jesse began messaging his friend in St. Louis about this secret affair with a cop. And so at this point, Short felt like he had just found his killer. So he grabbed a manila folder off his desk, stepped out of his office, locking the door behind him. Then he did a lap around the whole station, and eventually he spotted Brad Anderson in the locker room, chatting with a few other officers as he put on his uniform for his shift. Now, Short wanted to be very careful here because if Brad Anderson was the killer, he certainly didn't want him to realize he was under suspicion right now. So, Short waited in the hallway until Brad walked out of the locker room, and then, as casually as possible, Short caught up with him and pulled him aside. Short opened up the manila folder he had brought with him, and he showed Brad a photo of Jesse Valencia, asking if he recognized him. And Brad squinted at the photo for a second, and then after thinking, he said, "Yeah, that's the kid I arrested at a party a few months ago." Short asked Brad if he had seen Jesse at all since the arrest, and Brad nodded and said, "Yeah." He said that about a month ago, Jesse had called in a noise complaint, and Brad had been the one sent out to check on it. But by the time Brad got there, the noise had stopped, so he was only there for a couple of minutes before leaving. And that was it. To Short, nothing about Brad's demeanor seemed nervous or suspicious. In fact, it really seemed like he didn't have any clue why the detective was asking him about Jesse Valencia. So, if he was the killer, it seemed like he was going to be very hard to crack. Short was about to let Brad go and just wait to talk to him once he had more evidence. But just then, Brad's partner, Officer Rios, walked by. And when he walked by, he looked over and he saw the manila folder with Jesse Valencia's photo inside of it that Short was showing Brad Anderson. And Rios, without even thinking, made this comment under his breath that was clearly directed at his partner. It was like this really in bad taste comment where he said, "Oh, looks like your gay lover's dead." When Short heard this, he practically sprinted back to his office. Brad Anderson had sort of shrugged off the comment made by Rios about Jesse being his gay lover. But Short felt like what Rios said was a pretty big deal. Because even though, again, it was terrible, in bad taste humor, that's a terrible thing to say, but maybe there was truth in it. Maybe Rios knew that Brad Anderson was seeing Jesse Valencia. Maybe they really were in a relationship. Now, in the moment, Short did not aggressively follow up on that comment and demand to know if Brad had actually been in a relationship with Jesse before he died. Instead, all three of them just kind of went their separate ways. And Short, he hustled back to his office. And when he was in his office, right as he sat down, there was a knock on the door. And when the door opened, it was Short's secretary. And she told him there was someone who had been waiting to see him. And then she led in this very nervous-looking young man who introduced himself as Jesse's friend. And he said his name was Andy Schermerhorn. Andy sat down and told Short that just a few weeks earlier, he and Jesse had gone out together and then had gone back to Jesse's apartment. But around 3 a.m., they were interrupted by a knock on the door. Jesse went to answer it, and a uniformed police officer walked in, shining a flashlight around the room. And to Andy's surprise, Jesse led this officer right into the bedroom, and he joined them for a threesome. And then, after they were done, the cop looked at Andy and told him, "You better keep this a secret." Detective Short couldn't believe it. I mean, the final piece of evidence he needed had just fallen right into his lap. Andy said he did not know the officer's name. So Detective Short got out a department yearbook, and he told him to flip through it to see if maybe the guy he saw that night was in there. But Andy just held up his hand and said he didn't need to do that. And Detective Short was like, "Well, what do you mean? Why can't you do that?" And Andy said, "Well, because when I came in here, the guy I met, he was out in the hall." Based on the investigation that would follow this revelation, the following is what happened to Jesse Valencia in the early morning of the 5th of June, 2004. Around 3 a.m., right around the time that Jesse was leaving his friend Jennifer's party, Jesse's killer was drinking beers with a few friends after his work shift had ended. And then, just before dawn, the killer wrapped up, got in their car, and started to drive home. But as they were driving, they decided to make a stop along the way at Jesse's apartment. They were expecting another quick, no-strings-attached, late-night secret hookup just like they'd had before. But when they got there, Jesse was very drunk and in a terrible mood. Jesse confronted the killer. He told them that he had figured out that they were married. And so now, he was not interested in them at all. He didn't want to see them anymore. But when he told the killer to leave, the killer refused. And so Jesse said, "Fine, I'll go to your police chief and I will tell them all about our affair." And that's when the killer snapped. If their secret got out, it would cost them everything. Their job, their marriage, their family, their reputation. So, in their mind, they had to silence Jesse before he could ruin them. Jesse tried to run, but he only made it about a block before the killer caught up with him, wrapped a powerful arm around his neck, and put him in a vicious chokehold until his body went limp. And then, the killer laid Jesse's unconscious body out on the grass, took out a pocket knife, and brutally slashed his throat. On the way home, the killer, a police officer, very skillfully disposed of the murder weapon, ensuring that nobody would ever find it. Because they knew that the knife was the only piece of hard evidence that could ever link them directly to the murder. After that, they made their way back home, parked in the driveway, and as they were walking up to their front door, they looked up and saw their wife in the kitchen window, preparing a bottle for their baby son. And then, just before going inside, the killer unpinned the name tag from their uniform that said Anderson, and they swapped it for another name tag that they had hidden in their glove box. And this name tag was the killer's real name, Officer Stephen Rios. Rios was Brad Anderson's partner. He was the one who had identified Jesse's body at the crime scene and made that awful, revealing comment about Brad Anderson's gay lover. It's believed that Officer Rios was lying to Jesse about his name from the very beginning. And in fact, he had actually stolen the name tag not of Brad Anderson, but of the other Anderson in the department, Ted Anderson. He was using that officer's name tag and parading around like he was him whenever he was with Jesse, a calculated deception to protect his true identity. Stephen Rios was arrested, and in May of 2005, almost a year after Jesse's murder, he was found guilty of first-degree murder. But after an appeal, he was granted a new trial, and the charge was reduced to second-degree murder. However, he was still found guilty and was sentenced to life in prison. Jesse Valencia thought he was beginning a new chapter of his life that summer. Instead, within just 48 hours, he became the center of one of the most disturbing murder cases Columbia, Missouri had ever seen. Thank you so much for watching. If today's case stayed with you, let me know in the comments below. And if you'd like to watch more true crime stories, check out the playlist linked on screen now. Until next time. Dorothy Thompson, 60, entered her St. Bernard, Louisiana bank in the early afternoon on the 13th of April, 1985. She walked slowly since her hip hurt sharply with every step. She tried not to limp or appear shaky. She knew her small-town residents. She knew how they liked to speak and gossip about her, so she didn't give them new fodder. Even though she tried to walk tall and steady, the few tellers and customers in the lobby turned to look at her as soon as she entered. The quiet muttering began after they took her in. The quiet village of St. Bernard was 5 miles from New Orleans. People seemed pleasant there. Everyone seemed to know everyone else's business. Although charming, little towns had a sinister side. It facilitated rapid rumor spread. Dorothy seems to be the subject of most rumors for years. Dorothy conceded that she had given them much to talk about over the years. For most of her 39 years in this town, she owned the pet cemetery. Not just a few backyard tombs. Real, reputable business. Dorothy earned money from pet owners who bought plots in her cemetery to bury their pets. Dorothy was gossiped about for other reasons. The sting was that she owned more than the pet cemetery. She resided there. She lived alone in a cemetery front house. Most people thought it was impossible, especially with the cemetery's spooky stories. How could anyone live there full-time with all that? The ghost stories told in whispers weren't just about the creatures buried there. They concerned people. Dorothy's husbands and others perished on this land. Her first husband was a severe drinker and abuser. Her situation became so dire that she shot him in self-defense. Right there, he died. Her second spouse committed suicide. Dorothy discovered his body on their porch. 2 successive deaths sparked more Dorothy stories. Suggests she was a black widow who killed her husband. The gossips and storytellers didn't realize how deeply that death affected her. However, her mother's death 6 years earlier nearly broke her. Dorothy was deeply depressed after her mother died, and she spent a lengthy time in the hospital. She was improving, but some days were still hard. Dorothy tried to ignore the looks and whispers as she walked to the teller's window in the bank. She had to withdraw money to pay her handyman, Kenny Palmier. He helped her to the graveyard that morning. Since Dorothy didn't drive, Kenny was her chauffeur for the day. He was outside waiting to run her some more errands. Dorothy informed the teller of her budget. The teller counted and handed Dorothy the money, and she turned around and left in the afternoon heat. Dorothy was in Kenny's passenger seat as he drove along the highway at 4 in the afternoon. He took her home when they finished at the grocery shop. They spoke about the weather and Kenny's cemetery work that morning as they drove. Actually, Dorothy didn't know Kenny. The day prior, she employed him. He seemed polite, so she hoped he would stay. Over the past year, her handyman had a high turnover rate, and she needed consistency. Dorothy was no longer able to maintain the pet cemetery and her residence on the grounds. In addition to her damaged hip, she took depression medicine related that her weak and disoriented. Dorothy occasionally asked her neighbors for help, but she preferred hiring. She thought people needed solid work, she could help, and she appreciated it. However, several of her recent handymen were crooks, making employing them problematic. Last fall, her handyman, Elkin Childress, resided with her and worked on the grounds. However, Elkin always wandered the property instead of caring for it. Then she learned he was arrested for robbery. She thought he was scoping the property for ways to break in or steal. She was lucky he quit before she fired him. The person preceding Elkin was worse. He was Brandon, naughtier. Brandon, a loudmouth, started working for Dorothy after her mother died. Brandon and Bonnie moved in with Dorothy so Brandon could fix things while Bonnie drove her about. Like Elkin, she struggled with stealing with the naughtiers. Dorothy was on a lot of medicine for a severe depressed episode the previous spring. While she was sleepy from medication, the naughtiers got her to give them her land for pennies. When Dorothy finally discovered what had transpired, she demanded the naughtiers leave and hired a lawyer to overturn the transaction. Dorothy had spent the last year in a terrible, stressful court battle with the naughtiers over her land. She knew they were mad at her. Additionally, Brandon, a loudmouth, kept bragging about the dispute across town. He was not only talking about it publicly, but also contacting Dorothy directly to encourage her to withdraw the lawsuit. Dorothy would not abandon it. Her mother owned this cemetery and land, which she now owned. She cared greatly. She wouldn't surrender. Dorothy watched Kenny get off the freeway and onto her lengthy driveway from the passenger seat. Her driveway wound through thick trees because her house was far from town. She saw some tombstones ahead as they got closer to her home. The cemetery was huge. Just almost every animal was buried there. Some cemeteries were basic, etched stone slabs, but others were lavish, like a human-sized Buddha statue for a pet cat. Kenny stopped in front of the home and helped Dorothy carry her shopping. Dorothy paid him and promised to call when she had more work. Kenny went back in his car and drove down the long driveway till he disappeared into the trees. She stared from her door. Dorothy drank a glass of wine and turned on the TV in her bedroom at 9. After reviewing bills and answering cemetery clients' calls all evening, she was fatigued. After getting comfortable in bed, she heard the phone ring from across the house. Dorothy moaned. To answer the call, she took her wine glass and shuffled down the hallway to the kitchen. When she took it up, Patricia Newman, her friend, spoke. 3 years previously, a mutual friend introduced Patricia, half Dorothy's age, to her. Since Patricia had worked with the elderly, she initially cared for Dorothy. However, they got along well and were close, almost like mother-daughter. Dorothy relied on Patricia virtually daily for medication supervision and appointment transportation, as she lived 10 minutes away. Besides the hired workers, Patricia was the one she spent most time with. Patricia called now because of that. She inquired about Dorothy's pharmacy ride the next day. Dorothy said she did and thanked her. They talked longer before saying goodnight. Dorothy ended the call. After pouring herself more wine, she stood in her kitchen listening to the crickets. She heard something right before she left the kitchen and went to bed. The sound was a car gently climbing her lengthy driveway. Patricia Newman parked outside Dorothy's house after 1 in the afternoon the next morning. Patricia contacted Dorothy at 9 that morning to say she'd be late getting her up, but Dorothy didn't answer. Patricia called several more times after that, but Dorothy never answered, making her apprehensive. Dorothy was in her 60s, drank heavily, and took many medications. Patricia suspected Dorothy wasn't answering because of an accident or medical issue. She was to Dorothy's residence to check on her and do her errands. Patricia dashed to Dorothy's front door from her automobile. But no one answered when she knocked. After a while, she looked in the windows but saw no Dorothy or activity. The house felt quiet and silent. Back at the front door, Patricia tried the knob, but it was locked. Her knocking continued for a time. Patricia left the front door, got back in her car, and called the police after a few more minutes of Dorothy not answering and seeing no one. Patricia returned to Dorothy's house soon after, watching anxiously as 2 police officers opened her back door. In the few minutes before the authorities arrived, Patricia indicated how Dorothy could be inside and presumably harmed or that something was badly wrong. Officers spread out to search the house for entryways. They found the back door jammed, not locked. They were unjamming it now. After a few quick kicks, the door opened, and the 2 officers and Patricia entered. Patricia shouted Dorothy's name and searched every room. She suddenly realized she was hearing Dorothy's bedroom's TV. She glanced in the bedroom but didn't find Dorothy. Dorothy was nowhere to be found following a thorough house check. No issues were present in the house either. No disruption, struggle, or fall was present. Just like Dorothy vanished, it was over. The 2 officers were confused by the circumstance. Their perception was that nothing bad had transpired. This was not an emergency. Just left their TV on and wasn't home when they should have been. That was worrisome, but not enough to prompt a government response. Patricia knew Dorothy. She saw that this was so unlike her pal that something was awry. Patricia strongly expressed her anxiety to the 2 officers, but they encouraged her to wait, give it a few days, and call Dorothy again. If she didn't show up in 2 days, she could chat to them again. Patricia did as instructed when the police left, despite feeling something was wrong. She went home. She kept calling Dorothy, but got no answer. She asked about town, whether anyone had seen or heard from her, but nobody did. After 4 days, Patricia called the St. Bernard Sheriff's Office again. This time, she urged them to do something because Dorothy Thompson was still missing, and Patricia was confident she had been hurt. Detective Brian Valalong drove his cruiser into Dorothy Thompson's pet graveyard at 10:35 a.m., on the day Patricia made her urgent cry for help 4 days after Dorothy disappeared, with Sergeant Terrence Strada. The St. Bernard Sheriff's Office assigned both men to investigate Dorothy's disappearance. Valalong felt uneasy as he drove past dozens of animal tombstones and grave sites before arriving at the area. This place always frightened him. Finally, the cop's cruiser reached Dorothy's home at the end of the driveway. Valalong saw Patricia, a woman in her 30s, standing near the front door immediately. She appeared anxious and impatient as she waited for Valalong and Strada to exit their automobile. She was direct when they exited and approached her. She said the last officers only checked for welfare, not a search. To ensure Dorothy wasn't on the property, she needed them to examine Dorothy's house and grounds. Valalong and Strada promised to do so. She had to start over and describe the last time she saw or spoke to Dorothy. Patricia sounded annoyed and said she'd informed the other cops everything she knew, both in person and over the phone. She just wanted the quest to continue. But Valalong persisted. He said, "Look, I don't fully know the whole story, so please give me the information." She reluctantly informed Valalong. The night of the 13th, she called her friend to offer Dorothy a ride to the pharmacy the next day. Dorothy agreed. Patricia called her friend the next day to confirm she would pick her up that morning, but Dorothy didn't answer. Patricia visited the residence. Dorothy was absent. Dorothy didn't answer when she knocked. Patricia phoned the police because something seemed wrong. Arriving, they discovered the back door unlocked but jammed. After forcing it open, they walked inside and found nothing, but Dorothy was gone. No rhyme or rationale existed. Patricia now believed Dorothy had suffered and hoped they could help her. Valalong nodded and asked Patricia whether Dorothy had friends or family she could have stayed with. Patricia quickly declined. Dorothy lived alone and rarely left her house. She didn't drive, thus she had no car. Patricia stated she had called around but was not seen. No relatives, friends, or anyone. Patricia then became evident. She told officers she thought Dorothy would only leave her house that day or night if forced. Valalong inspected Strada. He knew Patricia was anxious about her buddy, but they needed to check first. He requested Patricia to show them the unlocked door so they could investigate. Valalong, Strada, and Patricia entered the home from the back entry moments later. He looked around the home and saw that Patricia was right. It was clean. There was no evidence of trouble within the residence. No trace of struggle or fall. It looked like the house was unaltered. That countered Patricia's notion that Dorothy would only leave if forced, implying a struggle. Dorothy seemed frail, according to Patricia. Valalong thought maybe she was forced out, but she didn't fight, so there's no trouble. Who knew? But it seemed unusual that nothing had been relocated if they were talking about an abduction. Valalong also saw valuable objects like Dorothy's TV as he walked around the house. This didn't appear like a robbery. Valalong agreed that something was wrong, unlike the first policeman who completed that welfare check. Because as he walked about, he saw clues that Dorothy had not planned to leave her home or had left quickly. A half-empty glass of wine was in the kitchen, and the bedroom TV was on. If someone was leaving for a long time, those wouldn't be... From what Patricia informed them, he could rule out a family emergency or last-minute travel because Patricia had called around and nothing had happened. Valalong stopped going around the house and asked Patricia about Dorothy's mental health. Patricia hesitated before telling Valalong that Dorothy was on a lot of medication, which occasionally made her mental condition murky. Valalong naturally thought, okay, maybe she left the house alone in a fog. After going outdoors, something happened. Animal, human, or fall anything may have happened. He knew the back door had been unlocked during the initial police welfare check, and even though it was jammed, it hadn't prevented them from entering. Maybe that door always got stuck, and that's all that happened. It was common for the rear door to jam when she left. Valalong told his partner about his theory that Dorothy might leave alone. He remarked, "Hey, she's clearly not here. Let's go out there and search the grounds and see if we can find her." Valalong visited Strada's office 15 days later at 7 a.m. on the 3rd of May, 1985, to update him on the case. Valalong believed foul play was likely at this time. Dorothy was gone, and there was no proof of what happened to her after several searches of her home and property. Patricia said Dorothy had a cross tattoo on her left index finger. Valalong had spent the last 2 weeks calling local hospitals and morgues to determine if any women had that marking. Valalong also interrogated Dorothy's neighbors and the bank tellers she visited before disappearing. He also interviewed town residents who knew her. He even found Dorothy's new handyman, Kenny Palmier, who the bank had confirmed drove her around the day she disappeared. Since Dorothy disappeared 20 days ago, neither of these folks had heard from her, nor Patricia. Even though nobody knew where Dorothy was and couldn't help the investigation, Valalong seemed to gather that everyone he spoke to disliked Dorothy. That she was a recluse, mad, had murdered her husbands, and buried them in the pet cemetery, and that her house and land were haunted. These rumors wouldn't help the case. Valalong found it intriguing that people thought this of her. Valalong's only lead came from chatting to Dorothy's lawyer a few days earlier. The lawyer said Dorothy was in a bitter property rights battle with Bonnie and Brandon Nadir, former workers. Dorothy's active litigation was a warning signal as her case was increasingly turning into an abduction or homicide. Valalong knew he had to talk to Bonnie and Brandon. However, Strata's phone rang while Valalong informed him at his desk. When Strata took it up and listened on the other end, he seemed shocked. Strata thanked the caller, disconnected up, and informed Valalong that a body had been found in the Mississippi River 40 miles downriver the day before. They suspected Dorothy. A few hours later, Valalong and Strata stood with Patricia Newman in a coroner's exam room. A long metal table sat in front of them. The river-found woman's body was on this table. Patricia was invited in to identify Dorothy. Valalong didn't see how Patricia could do that after seeing the body. The body was swollen and decaying. The medical examiner estimated this woman was in the water for weeks. Due to the body's severe deterioration, any autopsy findings were likely a guess. Nothing else was certain except that it was a homicide. The woman was found with a plastic bag over her head and many hefty shackles, perhaps to prevent her body from floating up and being detected. Valalong looked at Patricia, who was plainly nervous as she examined the body. It seemed to overwhelm her. Shaking and gaping, she was horrified. She spoke after seeing the body. She denied it was Dorothy. Valalong was briefly disappointed. For the case, he wanted to find Dorothy, not because he wanted her dead, but suddenly he remembered. He approached the body. Wearing gloves, he gently checked the woman's left hand. The cross tattoo was barely visible on her index finger. Dorothy was this. 4 days later, on May 7, Valalong started his day at his desk. Since he was investigating a homicide, he had plenty to do. The autopsy examiner found no water in Dorothy's lungs. Thus, they concluded that strangulation or suffocation, not drowning, caused the fatality. Valalong knew Dorothy may have been kidnapped and killed. Now that it was official, he was checking the case notes from the beginning to see if anything was missed while this was still a missing persons case. He began at Dorothy's last known location, her house. Dorothy's house was immaculate. Possible Dorothy was enticed from home and killed elsewhere. Valalong knew from her neighbors and Patricia that Dorothy was naturally introverted and rarely left her house. His best guess was that Dorothy was slain in her home and that the crime scene was so clean because she was overwhelmed fast. Since Kenny Palmier was the last person to see Dorothy alive when he dropped her off at her home at 4 p.m., Valalong initially suspected him. Valalong rechecked Kenny and discovered a good alibi. Valalong didn't know Kenny's motive, even if he didn't have an alibi. Dorothy had no trace of a robbery in her residence, and she didn't seem to have much money. She lacked wealth. She died by strangulation or suffocation, which is personal. That person would have needed a good cause. Valalong has not yet spoken to anyone with a major Dorothy issue. People had ideas about her, but they mostly said to avoid her because she lives on haunted land and killed her husbands. Everything seemed like local rumors. Nobody seemed to have a specific issue with her. That lawsuit with the Nadirs over her property rights remained. Valalong wasn't sure if this case was about actual animosity. He had not seen that. The lack of evidence was Valalong's main issue at this point. There were no witnesses, and they'd searched Dorothy's house repeatedly without success. Dorothy's body was forensic-free. Her body had been in the sea for so long that all forensics were gone. However, a knock on the door brought an officer in who told Valalong he had something he should see. Valalong got up and walked over. The officer stated they hauled him in for writing bad checks, and Dorothy Thompson was his former employer. Valalong was immediately curious and requested additional information. The officer said Elkin Childress had been Dorothy's live-in nanny for 2 months last fall. Elkin informed the officers who arrested him that he intended to labor at Dorothy's pet graveyard to uncover the riches. The story that Dorothy buried hundreds of thousands of dollars on her land joined the others. Elkin was preoccupied with finding it. He claimed he never did. When Valalong heard this, his heart raced. He'd never heard this treasure tale, but it wasn't weirder than any other Dorothy rumor. If Elkin wanted this wealth so much, he might have forced Dorothy to tell him where it was. The officer warned Valalong not to get too excited because Elkin had a valid alibi for the night Dorothy went missing. However, the officer stated Elkin mentioned something more that could enhance the inquiry. Elkin claims that Dorothy's acquaintance befriended her to inherit everything she owned. Her name was Patricia Newman. When the officer mentioned that, Valalong thought, why didn't I see this before? Patricia had contacted the police. In the beginning, she zealously pursued this probe, which Valalong assumed was because she concerned for her companion. He was now wondering if she was lying to appear innocent. Killers often join investigations to seem cooperative or put suspicion on others. Patricia entered Dorothy's residence several times before her body was located, giving her the chance to engage with the scene and hide evidence. Valalong turned and ran for Strata. Patricia must be spoken to immediately. This time, as a suspect. 6 days after Dorothy's body was found in the river, Valalong met with her close friend Patricia Newman again on May 8th. This time, the meeting was in a police interrogation room. Valalong watched Patricia intently at the interrogation table. She was both furious and anxious about being brought in. Hand fidgeting was especially noticeable. Valalong had carefully analyzed his approach. Since Patricia could have been lying to him, he started out nice to fool her into thinking everything she said was true. He would then surprise her with a sudden left turn to witness her reaction. He started with background inquiries regarding Patricia's connection with Dorothy and nodded appreciatively as Patricia described how they were good friends and how Patricia took care of Dorothy. However, Valalong unexpectedly asked her about Dorothy's estate and its value. She stated Dorothy owned the house and land, therefore no mortgages. It must be worth something, but she didn't know how much. Okay, forget the financial worth of the property. Is the property worth something to you, Patricia? Valalong replied. Valalong saw Patricia realize what was happening. She looked worried, as if she was beginning to realize she was being treated like a suspect rather than a witness. Patricia swiftly said, no, the property was not worth anything to her. She didn't want it, not at all. But she turned it around on Valalong, saying, look, if you're looking for someone who does want that property, well, you ought to speak to the Nadirs. Valalong now understood her reference. They were in that lawsuit with Dorothy before she disappeared and was found dead. But Valalong didn't speak. He looked at Patricia and said, oh, explain what you mean. Patricia told him the Nadirs had been Dorothy's live-in employees for years and were monsters. Dorothy said Brandon verbally abused her while working for her. He was also one of the major people propagating tales about Dorothy in town, including that she killed her husbands, her land was haunted, and she was mad. However, she indicated that wasn't the worst. Brandon was a thief, she alleged. She stated Brandon and his wife Bonnie had convinced Dorothy to sign away her property to them for nothing the year before, when she was on more depression medication than usual and not in sound mind. It hit Valalong then. He knew about the land lawsuit, but he didn't know the details. He simply understood there was a dispute. He also knew that Dorothy's lawyer had mentioned the Nadirs days earlier, but that was before Dorothy's body arrived and things were frantic, so Valalong hadn't followed up with her lawyers yet. He didn't realize how ugly this legal dispute was. Patricia said she urged Dorothy to hire a lawyer and fight because what they were doing to her was wrong. Dorothy had done it. She had a lawyer and a court date with the Nadirs 10 days before she disappeared. Valalong seemed astonished as he listened. This was evident and always in front of him. Dorothy's disappearance benefits the Nadirs. Clearly, the parties had beef. Valalong changed tactics at this point. He promised to talk to Patricia instead of treating her as a suspect. Valalong talked to Patricia longer. She remained suspect. Valalong was close to Dorothy, an older woman with no apparent heirs, but she hadn't seen her will. He wouldn't be surprised if Patricia was there. If true, she would have benefited from Dorothy's death like the naughty ears. However, Valalong knew he owed the naughty ears a conversation. He would call them next. 3 days later, Valalong was back in the precinct's interrogation room in the afternoon on May 10. But it was busier this time. He found 1-year-old Brandon Nautier for an interview. Brandon had consented to talk to Valalong, but he insisted on having his lawyer there, which instantly suggested he had something to hide. Since talking to Patricia, Valalong discovered Brandon's criminal history, including assault. Valalong also heard from town residents that Brandon had trouble keeping his... And then finally, when the killer felt like they had waited long enough, they reached up and they grabbed a metal coat hanger off the hook in the closet. And then they burst out of the closet door. And before Linda could do anything, before she could make a sound or even react, she was totally caught off guard. The killer was on top of her, and they had wrapped the coat hanger tight around her throat. Linda struggled. She clawed at her own throat to try and get this thing off of her. But the killer was so much stronger than her, and there was nothing she could do. It didn't take long for the killer to have their way with Linda. And then after they were done, they strangled her until she was dead. And once the killer was finished, they hopped off the bed and just climbed right back out the same window they had come in through, and they wandered off into the night. And the killer would get to replay this crime over and over in their head all day the next day until it was time for football practice. It would turn out that Linda was murdered by her son's football coach, a man named Joseph Mills. Joseph was a fixture in Tim's life. He would drive him to and from practice every single day because Linda didn't have a car. But while Tim saw Joseph as a helpful mentor in his life, Joseph had apparently developed a dark and total fixation on Tim's mother. And during all those trips to her house to drop off her son, Joseph was planning. He was watching. He was figuring out how and when he would attack her. Back in 1981, Joseph Mills was actually interviewed by police over the phone a day after Linda's murder. But he was never really considered an actual suspect. Instead, after Joseph murdered Linda, he just continued to drive her son Tim to and from football practice every day. And Tim would, even very tragically, begin to rely on Joseph for emotional support as he was grieving the loss of his mother. He was confiding in her killer, and he just didn't know. And then, even more tragically, as time went on and Linda's case went cold, one of the pictures that Tim hung up in his bedroom to remind himself to stay positive was a picture of his football team. Tim had no idea that his mother's killer was literally standing right behind him in the back row of that very picture. In December of 2019, Joseph Mills was charged with first-degree murder and sexual battery. He was eventually sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. Until next time. See ya. A chilly and rainy evening in late January of 1965 marks the beginning of the story. In the Lebanonian village of Antelias, which is located just a short distance to the north of Beirut, we are situated on a stretch of shoreline. Furthermore, for a young police officer by the name of Fareed Jabber, this evening was about to bring about a sea change in his life. Everything about the weather was terrible. The sand on the beach was transformed into a chilly, dark slush as a result of the continuous and freezing rain that was blowing down. In addition to the deep darkness that was pressing in from all directions, the wind howled in from the sea. The kind of night that would have been ideal for sensible people to be at home, tucked away in their cozy beds. Furthermore, Fareed fervently wanted that he was one of its members. While he was out here strolling along the beach with his companion, he had his jacket drawn over him, but it wasn't doing anything to help him. The chilly air had already penetrated his bones to a great extent. However, Fareed was in need of this employment. For someone who lived in a small town like Antelias, being a police officer was more than simply a job. It was a future. Not only did it pay well, but it was also respected, and for Fareed, it was the basis around which he was constructing his entire existence with his life. He was responsible for a family and a future that he needed to ensure. There was no way that I could let this position go. In other words, if that meant patrolling a deserted beach in the midst of a winter storm, then that is exactly what he would do without hesitation. He acknowledged that there were going to be aspects of the job that would be quite inconvenient for him. To put it simply, he was completely unaware of how miserable this particular evening was going to become. It was a phone call that brought them out here in the first place. This was the reason why they were here. Someone had called the station a little while ago, and their voice was hurried and a little bit scared because of the situation. They reported that they had saw something peculiar lying on the beach, close to the waterline. Despite the fact that they were unsure of what it was, they thought it appeared to be a person when viewed in the dim light. It is a body. At this point, Antelius was a tranquil location. The occurrence of violent crime was virtually unheard of. There were more than just bodies that were discovered washed up on the strand. In light of this, Farid and his companion were skeptical as they made their way through the sand, their flashlight beams making unsteady circles in the darkness. According to Farid, it was most likely just some trash that had washed up on the shore, or it could have been a gigantic dead marine monster. It was more than anything else that he was irritated. Being called out into this storm for something that was almost certainly going to be of no consequence seemed like a waste of time during that moment. The idea that they were going to discover a human body on the beach was completely out of the question. Then, however, as they continued to stroll, something drew the attention of their lights. A shadowy figure was laying unmoving on the sand at a considerable distance from the beach. It was nothing more than a lump in the darkness, a mere item. Nevertheless, even from a much greater distance, there was an indisputably human quality to its appearance. This was the perfect shape. This was the perfect size. There was an instantaneous disappearance of the annoyance that Farid had been experiencing, and in its stead was a chilly knot of dread in his stomach. This was the end. This is what the person who called came upon. He and his partner shared a glance with one another. They chose not to flee. You do not behave in such manner. You have no idea who or what is waiting for you at this moment. In the event that this was in fact a person, and if something unfortunate had occurred to them, the person responsible might still be in the vicinity, keeping a watchful eye from the rocks or the dunes. They moved at a measured pace as they approached each other carefully. They continued to keep their headlamps on, looking at everything from the breaking waves on one side to the dark and murky dunes on the other side of the region. But there was nobody on the beach. Anything else that was out of place was not present. The only things that could be seen on the sand in front of them were the wind, the rain, and that solitary person. Farid's expertise as a police officer took control as they approached closer, but his mind was still having trouble accepting what his eyes were witnessing. Now, he was able to make out additional details. The physical form of a torso, arms, and legs. This is most certainly he saw Dorothy's chained ghost and asked him to come forward. Duran raised his eyebrows skeptically but didn't respond. The narrative started off strange and hard to believe, was not natural in any sense. He was unable to pinpoint exactly what it was, but the proportions did not seem to be quite right. Simply put, the silhouette, timidity, the old man finally said what he knew. A decades-long inquiry and various confessions have led investigators to reconstruct Dorothy Thompson's the 13th of April 1985 night. Brandon Nautier drove his pickup up Dorothy's long, twisting path through the woods after 9 that night. Brandon watched the scenery out the window as he drove. All the tombstones, trees, the house ahead, and the grounds. He decided to stop waiting for his wealth. He must take it. Dorothy did not deserve this, he believed. Brandon believed Dorothy wasn't worthy of life. Brandon arrived outside Dorothy's house. After parking his truck, he calmly walked around the house to the rear. He knocked. Dorothy reached the door. She spotted Brandon through the glass. She opened the door despite seeming bewildered. After she did, Brandon didn't hesitate. He jumped on her. Dorothy tried to scream, but he grabbed her throat and silenced her. Then, he silently strangled them to safeguard the scene. As they drew their service guns, the metal was cold and heavy in their hands, and they conducted a search that was both more extensive and more comprehensive in the local vicinity. There was a search conducted behind the rocks, in the sand dunes, and anywhere else that someone might be hiding. But there was no one present. With the exception of the two of them and the gloomy discovery that was lying at their feet, the beach was entirely quiet and empty. They returned to the body while the rain continued to fall, and the light from their flashlights created a small, isolated bubble of light in the wide blackness that surrounded them. The two of them began conversing, their voices low and intense, as they attempted to determine what their next step would be. Now, you need to keep in mind that this took place in a little community in Lebanon in the middle of the 1960s. Their law enforcement agency was not a large high-tech enterprise that covered a large area. A small force with few resources, they were a formidable adversary. They were unable to call for assistance or notify a forensics team because they did not have radios. They were just unable to provide the kind of comprehensive response that would be expected in the event of a homicide in the modern era. It would be necessary for one of them to really walk all the way back to the station, file a report, and rally the other police in order to initiate any kind of inquiry. It was a laborious and time-consuming process. On top of that, killings were so uncommon in this area that they did not even have a conventional procedure for dealing with them. In a very literal sense, they were making it up as they went along to get what they wanted. As they stood over the body and discussed the various choices available to them, a plan started to take shape. To do so was the only reasonable course of action. It was necessary for one of them to remain here with the body. In order to ensure that the murderer would not return for any reason, they were required to keep a watchful eye on the crime scene and make certain that it was not altered in any way. It would be necessary for the other officer to make the arduous journey back to the station in order to initiate the formal investigation. By the time dawn rolled around, the objective was to have a full team of investigators back here. On the other hand, this meant that one of them would have to spend the entire night on this icy, storm-tossed beach by themselves next to a headless body. The two officers exchanged glances with one another. Both back then and now, it was a rule that was never explicitly stated. All of the challenging tasks are given to the junior man. Fareed was the inferior officer in the hierarchy. It was immediately apparent that he was going to be the one to take on this dreadful responsibility. He recalled the things that he had always told himself about this work from the beginning. He was in need of it, despite the fact that it would be uncomfortable. He was in need of the income. It didn't matter how terrible the responsibility was, he couldn't afford to lose his job because he refused to perform it. In response, Fareed simply nodded his head as his companion looked at him with a questioning expression on his face. He said, "Fine," with his voice barely audible over the wind. "I'm fine. I'll stay here. I'll watch the body. You go get the investigation started. I'll see you in the morning." After his buddy had departed, Fareed felt the whole weight of the situation come crashing down on him. His silhouette was swiftly swallowed up by the rain and the darkness. Now he was all by himself. His realization of what he was going to have to accomplish over the next few hours was a terrifying experience. There were other factors at play as well, such as the bitterly low temperatures and the pouring rain. The fact that he was standing guard over a person who had been murdered was the catalyst. This barren expanse of sand was an area that he was sharing with a deceased individual. In addition to that, there was the persistent and nagging fear that was present. There was a possibility that the individual who committed this crime, who murdered this man and severed his head, is still at large. It was true that they had conducted a search, but it was not absolutely certain that the murderer was not hiding someplace close and keeping an eye on him. It was not the cold that caused the shiver to run down his spine, rather it was the thought that caused it. What would happen if they returned? What would happen if they desired to influence the body in a different way? What would happen if they regarded him as a potential danger or a witness who needed to be suppressed? Fareed was currently protecting the evidence, but he was also a possible target for the investigation. It was the stuff that nightmares are made of. Still, he made an effort to stabilize himself. Reminding himself that he had been trained as a police officer, he said. In no way was he helpless. He was holding his assigned handgun, which was securely ensconced in its holster. On his belt was the service knife that he carried. If someone did emerge from the shadows with the intention of attacking him, he would be able to protect himself. He was capable of holding his own. This was a mantra that he chanted to himself over and over again in order to combat the fear. The hours passed by glacially. There was never a sign of relief. Fareed felt the force of it pressing down on him, and he shook violently. It was expected of him to remain cautious, keeping a watchful eye on the crime scene and being aware. On the contrary, sleep was not even a possibility. On the other hand, he was so miserable, so thoroughly fatigued, and so incredibly cold. In an effort to preserve the meager amount of body heat that he still possessed, he found himself lowering down onto the wet sand, drawing his knees to his chest, and putting his arms around himself. In the midst of this pitiful circumstance, all he was doing was attempting to locate a sliver of solace. And he did that at some point in time. In spite of the fact that he was freezing and terrified, as well as the fact that there was a dead body only a few feet away, he became so comfortable that his body betrayed him. It was somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning when Fareed Jabber finally succumbed to sleep. After some time had passed, he suddenly awoke with a start. The pounding of his heart could be felt in his chest. Suddenly, he was overcome with a rush of utter panic. It was immediately apparent to him that he had committed a grave error. It was not appropriate for him to go to sleep. During the course of the inquiry into the murder, he was meant to be protecting the body, which is the single most significant piece of evidence of all. He recalled his anxiety about the possibility that the murderer may return. Additionally, he had just dozed off, leaving the location in a state of utter vulnerability. He had even bigger aspirations for the place, beyond it just being a simple pit stop. He wanted to turn it into a true destination. After all, the White Mountains were known for being incredibly beautiful, and the specific spot where the Willies lived, in the Notch, was no exception. Their house was situated right on a riverbank, nestled in a deep mountain valley. It was surrounded on all sides by dense woods and towering, mist-covered peaks. It was honestly a breathtaking view. And as soon as Sam had first laid eyes on it, he knew. He knew that this place could become a famous destination for poets and authors and artists. It was the kind of place people would write songs and books about. In his mind, it was absolutely perfect. But so far, his dream of making a life out here at the Notch House had been a whole lot of hard work. The house itself was large, but it was really old. And it had been completely abandoned for quite a while before he and his family had moved in. So it was in really bad shape, quite dilapidated. To help with the massive amount of work, Sam had hired 2 men to live on the property and help him fix it up. And together they had already done some significant work to expand the house and the barn to be able to accommodate more travelers. But Sam knew he still had a very long way to go before the Notch House could be considered some kind of artist's retreat. And now, with this extensive new damage from the most recent storm, he had even more things to add to his never-ending list of repairs. But he also had to admit to himself that the property damage was actually the least of his problems. Because as he and his wife Polly stood there, looking around at the aftermath of the storm, he knew that deep down, he was lucky. He was lucky their house was even still standing. He was lucky that he and his family were even still alive. That storm had been catastrophic. And as Sam thought about how close they had all come to death, his heart began to race. He started to wonder if maybe Polly was right. Maybe they really should just pack up the family, abandon this dream, and go back to the simple, safe life of farming. But leaving felt like admitting failure. His big dream would be over before it even really began. There would be no artist retreat, no tourist mecca. He wouldn't be some creative benefactor. He would just be a farmer again. So he took a deep breath, turned to his wife, and asked her to please just give this place one more chance. He promised her that he would do everything he possibly could to not just repair the property, but to make it safe and secure so it could withstand whatever the mountain decided to throw at them next. And Polly, she hesitated for a moment. But ultimately, she believed in her husband. She trusted him. And so she nodded in agreement. For the next 2 months, Sam and his 2 hired workers labored practically around the clock. They worked from sunup to sundown, repairing all the damage from the storm. They fixed up broken windows and replaced missing shingles. They cleared away all the rocks and fallen trees, which was an exhausting task that took forever. And then, once all the immediate repairs were finally done, Sam kept working. But now he focused his energy on improving the property, on making it stronger. As the weeks turned into a month, and then 2, he worked tirelessly to build his family a truly secure home. He wanted them to be much safer against any future storms. He reinforced the walls of the house and built a whole new, stronger roof. He even started to map out different disaster scenarios in his mind so that no matter what happened, he and his family would always be prepared. One particular disaster scenario that he was especially concerned about was the large boulder that was situated on the mountainside directly behind their house. It was a massive piece of granite the size of a small cottage. He was worried that if there was another big rock slide, that boulder might just break free, topple onto their home, and crush them all in an instant. He and his workers tried to figure out a way to move it, but they soon realized that was impossible. The boulder was just way too big, too heavy. But in the end, they found a very creative way to make sure it would not be a danger to them. And while Sam did all of this hard work, he started to feel a lot better about everything. Each security measure he put in place, every new nail he hammered, was proof to him that he didn't have to sacrifice his ambitions for his family's safety. He could have both. A few weeks later, on the night of August 28th, Samuel Willie stood by a downstairs window watching another wild storm rage outside. Heavy rain was pummeling the glass, and Sam could hear the powerful wind battering the sides of the house, making the whole structure groan. It was pitch black outside, but every now and then, a brilliant burst of lightning would flash across the sky, lighting up the entire valley for a few terrifying seconds before it plunged back into darkness again. And each time this happened, a deafening crash of thunder would follow, a sound so loud it seemed to shake the house right down to its very foundation. Behind Sam, in the kitchen, Polly was gathered with their 5 children and the 2 men that were working on the property. They were all sitting around the kitchen table. Polly and the kids in particular were very, very scared. The whole group of them were reading Bible verses out loud, their voices trembling in these frantic, hushed tones. It was like they were trying to will the storm to be over, trying to cling on to their faith and pray that they would all be okay. Sam could hear the fear in his wife's voice, and he really couldn't blame her. This was quite possibly the strongest storm that either of them had ever seen out here. It was even bigger, even more violent than the one that had completely destroyed their property over the summer. The rain seemed impossibly powerful, coming down so hard and so fast that the river had already overflowed its banks. And each time there was a flash of lightning, Sam could see that the water levels were getting higher and higher, almost by the second. And so Sam, he was admittedly quite scared himself. He was trying to keep it hidden, to be the strong father and husband, but his heart was racing and he was deeply anxious. But at the same time, he told himself that this was the moment he had prepared for all summer long. This was it. He had done so much work to make sure this house was a safe place during storms, and he felt like they should be okay. But at the same time, the deafening sounds from outside and the terrified voices of Polly and his children were making it really, really hard to believe that was actually true, that they were really safe here. So for a little while, Sam just kept his vigil, looking out the window, listening to his family praying behind him. But then eventually, he turned around, and as calmly as he possibly could, he told them all to go to bed. He said it was going to be fine. He would stay up and keep watch through the night. Polly, who was visibly still very scared, just nodded. She got up and went off with the kids. And for the next few hours, Sam stayed at his post by the window and watched the storm. And for the most part, there wasn't a whole lot of drama. I mean, it was incredibly loud and windy. It was obvious the river was flooding. He knew there was going to be more damage to clean up tomorrow. But Sam was starting to think that, maybe they were going to get through this thing. But then, a little after midnight, Sam heard a sudden, extremely loud banging sound from outside. He froze, because he knew instantly it was not thunder. It sounded more like a huge explosion. Almost immediately, Sam knew what it had to have been. The barn. The barn must have collapsed. And the thought that this storm had just taken out an entire building, a building that he himself had reinforced, turned Sam's worry into outright panic. And so Sam screamed for his wife and the workers and his kids to wake up. He yelled that it wasn't safe. Get away from the windows. We have to find cover. And so for the next few seconds, the family and the workers, all 9 of them, were frantically scrambling around the house in the dark trying to find a safe spot, but they didn't know where it was. But as they were sort of navigating through the chaos, trying to find the right place to go to weather the storm, Sam heard an even louder bang. And then there were screams all around him. And then he felt himself go airborne as a heavy object slammed into his back. The following evening, an exhausted traveler named John Barker walked down that very same road, heading in the direction of the Notch house where the Willies lived. John was a merchant, and he was passing through the White Mountains on his way home after a long business trip. He had made this trip many times before, so he knew the road well. But the road he was on now was barely recognizable. It was flooded in many places, and there were rock slides and debris everywhere. The journey was slow-going and pretty miserable. But he knew that at the halfway point was this house, the Notch house, where Sam Willie and his family lived. He knew they were in the process of converting their house into an inn for travelers. And even though it wasn't fully established yet, John was confident that he could probably get into that house, get a hot meal, and rest for a little while before he had to make the rest of his journey. But when he finally rounded the corner into the valley where the house was, he just froze. The entire area was a complete disaster. The river had clearly and completely flooded, and now half the land in front of him was just underwater. There had also clearly been a huge rock slide. The barn was only half standing, a skeleton of what it once was. And the field in front of the Willies' home was completely buried in tons of rocks and other mountain debris. But the truly astonishing thing was that right in the middle of all this destruction and ruin, the Willies' house was still standing. And as John carefully maneuvered his way closer to it, he realized it was more than just intact. The house was pristine. There wasn't a single thing broken or out of place on it. Not even a single window pane was cracked. Relieved and a little bit amazed by this miracle, John hurried right up to the entrance and knocked loudly. But no one answered. So eventually, he just turned the knob, found the door was unlocked, and opened it. He poked his head in and called out to Sam. But he didn't hear anything. No sound of a reply, and no sound of anyone moving around inside. So John tentatively stepped all the way into the house and just kept calling out to the family as he walked from room to room. But he quickly realized the house was completely empty. It was also a bit of a mess. There were clothes scattered all over the floor, and the beds and sheets had been yanked around and were messy. And on the kitchen table, the family Bible was wide open. John stood there in the middle of the empty home, trying to work out what could have possibly happened here. The mess suggested that, clearly the family had been here somewhat recently, but they must have left in a great hurry. So John guessed that they must have gone down the mountain to wait out the storm somewhere else, maybe at a neighbor's house or at the tavern that was miles away at the end of the road. And since the Willies were not here to give him permission to stay, John needed to figure out what he was going to do. He didn't really like the idea of sleeping in their home without them there, but he really had nowhere else to go. It was almost nighttime, and he could barely manage the ruined road during the daylight, let alone in the dark. So, even though he felt kind of bad about it, he picked a bed and tried to get some rest. But just as he began to drift off to sleep, he heard a deep, guttural moaning sound coming from somewhere outside the house. John immediately shot up, fully awake, and rushed over to a window. But he couldn't see anything. Night came really fast in the White Mountains, and it was now almost completely dark outside. He waited, listening, to see if he would hear anything else, but he didn't. So he decided he must have imagined the sound, and he turned to go back to bed. But as he did, the moaning started again, and this time it was louder, closer. John gasped as a terrible thought occurred to him. He wondered if maybe that sound was one of the Willies. He wondered if maybe they hadn't actually left the property after all, but were maybe outside somewhere, injured or in trouble because of the storm. So John sprinted outside into the darkness. But again, it was pitch black, and he didn't have any kind of light to help guide his way. And so once he was out there, he just began shouting, calling out to whoever it was, asking if they needed help. And eventually, the horrible moaning sound answered him. But the sound kind of echoed all over the valley, so John couldn't pinpoint exactly where it was coming from, other than it was clearly outside somewhere in the debris. After frantically looking around and not finding whoever it was, John realized that finding the injured person was going to be impossible right now. It was just too dark. And he would unfortunately have to wait until the morning. So, very reluctantly, John went back inside the house. And for hours, he just sat there in bed and listened to the pained moaning continue outside. Finally, in the morning, when the first bit of sun peeked over the mountain ridge, John hurried right back outside to look around. And this time, he very quickly found the source of that moaning sound. It was one of the Willie's oxen. It was moaning in pain from being trapped under some heavy debris near the ruins of their barn. John immediately rushed forward and began hauling the heavy wooden planks and rocks off the poor animal. And after he had finally freed the ox, it amazingly staggered to its feet and just hobbled away into the woods. It was basically okay. But after it was gone, John felt this sort of sick uneasiness settle over him. Even though the sound had just been from an ox and he had saved it, he just felt like there was something deeply wrong here. And so he decided that he had to go and see the Willies with his own eyes just to make sure they really were okay. So, even though it was really early and John was still very tired, he immediately gathered up his things and set off down the ruined road. Hours later, around noon that same day, John Barker finally staggered out of the mostly destroyed mountain pass and made his way towards the tavern at the bottom of the road. When John stepped inside, he was utterly exhausted. He was drenched from the awful journey he had just taken. But more than that, he was really worried about the Willie family. Because as he had made that trip down the road, he had passed by the neighbors' homes along the way, and he had kind of expected to see the Willies taking shelter in one of them. But no, the Willies were not in any of the neighbors' homes. And in fact, basically none of the neighbors were in their houses either. They were all here, in this tavern. It was like everybody who lived on this road had come to this tavern to wait out the storm. But when John looked around the crowded room, he could tell right away that the Willies were not there either. And this made John's stomach drop. Because if they weren't at their house, and they weren't in any of the neighbors' homes, and now they were not in this tavern with the rest of their neighbors, that had to mean something was very wrong. And so John actually called out to the entire room and asked if anyone had seen the Willies since the storm. And the tavern got really quiet as all of its occupants all began looking around at each other, seeing if anybody had any information. But eventually, everyone just shook their head and said, "No, we don't know where they are." And that's when John said to the crowd that, well, the Willies are missing. A few hours later, a 12-man search party left that tavern and headed right back up the road towards the Notch. They were led by one of the Willies' neighbors, a man named Edward Melcher, who lived at the base of the mountain on a farm with his family. The recent storm had done quite a bit of damage to Edward's property as well. And so he and his family, like most other people that lived in this area, had gone to the tavern to seek shelter. Edward and his family, much like the Willies, were good people who were just trying to carve out a living in this harsh part of the world, and there were not a lot of people doing that. This was a very small, tight-knit community. And so, they always helped each other out whenever they could. And so, this was no exception. But as desperately as Edward and the rest of the search party wanted to get to the Willies' property and find these people, it took them so long to navigate the destroyed road that by the time they actually got to the property, it was after midnight and really too dark to look for anything. So they just went right into the Willies' house to wait until morning. Once he was inside, Edward could see that the home really was just as John Barker had described it. It was sort of a mess inside, but there was absolutely no damage to it from the storm. Edward had heard that Sam was really freaked out about a storm that they had had earlier that summer. And because of that storm and because of the damage it had done, he had gone way out of his way to really develop his property to prepare it for the next big storm. And it seemed like all of his preparations and all the reinforcements on his land had paid off, because here his house was, standing tall and completely unharmed. But that was also kind of confusing. It's like, if you prepared this house so well for a storm, and clearly it was able to withstand the storm, why on earth did the Willies leave? As Edward continued to walk around the silent house, he saw that the Willies' Bible was still lying on the kitchen table, wide open. And when he leaned over and read the passage that was on the page, he couldn't help but shiver when he saw what it said. It said, "The Lord also thundered in the heavens, and the highest gave his voice, hailstones and coals of fire." Hours later, when the sun finally began to come up, Edward and the others went outside and began searching the devastated property for any sign of the Willies. And over the next few hours, the original party of 12 grew as more and more people showed up to assist in the search. By this point, word had spread pretty far about the family's disappearance, and so residents from all over the White Mountains had come here to help. And eventually, hundreds of people were combing the mountainside, looking for the Willies, or at least to find a single clue about where they might have gone. At around noon, when still absolutely nothing had been found, Edward decided he would go search closer to the river, since by this point the water levels had gone down some. And when he got to the water's edge, he began to hear this strange, low buzzing sound. And so he followed it. And eventually, he saw something poking out from behind some debris. And when he saw what it was, Edward began to scream for help. The thing that Samuel Willie was most afraid of happening in a large storm was a massive rock slide, especially with that huge boulder positioned right behind his house. But when Sam realized it was going to be impossible to move that boulder or to otherwise shield his family from falling mountain rocks, he came up with what he thought was a